The Butcher of Willow Creek. I'd been a private investigator for years, long enough to know when I was walking into a bad situation. And the minute I drove into Willow Creek, I felt it. The kind of tension that coils around your spine and stays there, tight as a wire. The town, tucked away in the middle of nowhere, was too quiet. The kind of quiet that makes you suspicious. I'd been hired by the sister of a man who had gone missing. His name was Mark Sullivan, and he wasn't the first person to disappear in Willow Creek. But his sister was desperate, and no one else seemed interested in finding out what had happened to him. The local police had written it off as another wanderer who'd simply left town without a word. The problem was, people who wandered away from Willow Creek never seemed to wander back. The town had a reputation, you see, not an official one. Nothing that would show up in the papers or on a map, but locals knew. They whispered about it. Willow Creek had secrets, old ones, buried beneath its quaint charm. And at the center of those secrets was a name I kept hearing over and over again, whispered like a curse: the Butcher. The first time I heard the name, it was from an old man at the local diner. I had been in town for about a day, asking around, showing Mark Sullivan's picture, and getting nowhere fast. Most of the locals gave me tight-lipped smiles and said they hadn't seen or heard anything. A few were even kind enough to suggest I pack up and leave before I got too curious. But this man, sitting at the counter nursing a cup of black coffee, gave me a hard look when I showed him Mark's photo. "He ain't the first, you know," the old man said, his voice gravelly from what I guessed were years of smoking. "Folks go missing in these parts. Always have." "Yeah, I've heard," I replied, leaning in closer. "Do you know why?" He didn't answer right away. He stared into his coffee, swirling the dark liquid with a spoon, as if contemplating whether or not to share a town secret with an outsider. "The Butcher," he finally muttered. "That's what folks say. He gets the ones who ask too many questions." The name sent a shiver through me, though I tried not to show it. "Who's the Butcher?" The old man didn't answer. He just slid off his stool, threw a few crumpled bills on the counter, and walked out of the diner without another word. I didn't know much about the Butcher at that point, only that he was supposedly the ghost of an old serial killer from decades ago. Back in the late 70s, there had been a string of disappearances, mostly drifters and travelers passing through. The local sheriff at the time had tried to investigate, but the case never went anywhere, and eventually, the disappearances stopped. The Butcher became nothing more than a ghost story, or so everyone wanted to believe. But as I spent more time in Willow Creek, I realized the killings hadn't stopped. They'd just gotten quieter, smarter. Mark Sullivan wasn't the first to vanish, and he wouldn't be the last. I started piecing things together, talking to people, following up on rumors. There were too many coincidences, too many unexplained disappearances over the years. And the more I looked, the more I started to see a pattern. All the people who had gone missing had one thing in common. They'd all started asking questions, just like me. It wasn't long before the Butcher, or whoever he was, started to take notice of me. At first it was small things. A note slipped under my motel room door. "Go home." The tires on my car slashed while I was inside a grocery store. One night I came back to my room to find the door slightly ajar, though nothing seemed to be missing. But then things escalated. One evening, I was walking back to my motel from a bar, the sun setting behind the thick line of trees that surrounded the town. The streets were empty, and a thick fog was beginning to roll in, shrouding the town in an eerie quiet. I heard footsteps behind me, just a soft, steady rhythm that matched mine, too close to be a coincidence. I sped up, and so did the footsteps. I ducked into an alleyway, trying to shake whoever was following me, but the footsteps stopped as soon as I turned the corner. I glanced back, expecting to see someone, anyone, but the street was empty. That night, I didn't sleep. A few days later, I met with Sheriff Daniels. He was a middle-aged man, probably in his 50s, with a grizzled face and an easy smile. He was polite enough when we spoke, but there was something about the way he avoided my questions that made me uneasy. Every time I brought up Mark Sullivan or any of the other missing people, he would steer the conversation away, focusing instead on the importance of keeping the peace in a small town. "We don't need outsiders stirring up trouble, Mr. Jennings," he said, giving me a hard look from behind his desk. "Willow Creek is a quiet place, and we aim to keep it that way." I could feel the warning in his words, though he delivered them with a smile. Daniels was hiding something. I knew it, but I couldn't figure out what. As I was leaving the station, I noticed something odd. A photograph on the wall caught my eye, an old black and white photo of the town council from the 1970s. There, in the back row, was a man I recognized from a newspaper clipping about the original Butcher case. The sheriff at the time, a man named Roy Daniels, Sheriff Daniels' father. The pieces were starting to come together, but I still didn't have enough to go on. I needed proof, something that tied the current sheriff or anyone else in town to the disappearances. And I knew where I had to look. There was an old slaughterhouse on the outskirts of Willow Creek. It had been abandoned for years, long since fallen into disrepair, but locals said it was where the butcher had taken his victims. The place was a legend in the town, a spot teenagers dared each other to visit on dark nights. But no one really believed the butcher had used it. It was just part of the myth. I decided to check it out for myself. The night I went to the slaughterhouse, the air was thick with the scent of decay, the distant hum of cicadas filling the silence. The building loomed ahead, a hulking structure that had seen better days, its windows shattered and its walls covered in graffiti. As I approached, the hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. The door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. Inside, the air was damp and cold, and the floor was littered with debris. I swept my flashlight across the room, the beam cutting through the darkness, and that's when I saw it. A large butcher's table, stained with dark, dried blood. Tools, old and rusted, were strewn across the room, knives, cleavers, hooks. And in the far corner of the room, hidden behind a pile of crates, was something worse. Bones. I froze, my stomach twisting into knots. Human bones, piled together in a grotesque display. Some were old, brittle and yellowed with age, but others were fresh. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat, but before I could leave, I heard a sound behind me. The door creaked shut, and when I turned around, there he was, Sheriff Daniels. He stood in the doorway, blocking my exit, his face calm, almost serene. "You shouldn't have come here, Jennings," he said, his voice soft but firm. "Why?" I demanded, my heart pounding in my chest. "Why are you protecting him? Who is the butcher?" Daniels didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped aside, and another figure emerged from the shadows. It was the old man from the diner. He wasn't just some local drifter, as I had assumed. He was the butcher, an aging, hollow-eyed man who had spent decades perfecting his art. The townspeople hadn't just been protecting him, they had been complicit. Sheriff Daniels, the town council, even some of the locals, they all knew. They'd been covering for him, keeping his secret in exchange for their own safety. The butcher had been selecting his victims carefully, choosing those who wandered too close to the truth, just as I had. "You see," Daniels said, his voice taking on a chilling calm, "Willow Creek survives because of the butcher. He keeps the balance. We protect him, and he keeps us safe." I backed away, my mind racing, but it was no use. The butcher smiled, a sick, twisted grin, as he stepped toward me. "We warned you," he said. "We warned you to leave." I don't know how long it took. Hours, maybe, days. Time had no meaning as I lay there, helpless, while they prepared me for what was coming. They didn't just kill their victims, they displayed them, posed them like grotesque art, leaving their bodies as a warning to anyone who dared to ask too many questions. And now, I'm part of the collection. When they find me, I'll be just another body in the slaughterhouse, just another victim of the Butcher of Willow Creek, and the town will go on, quiet and serene, hiding its darkest secret in plain sight.
The Whispering Dolls. It was a strange inheritance, to say the least. When my great-aunt Margaret passed away, I hadn't expected to inherit anything at all. She had been a distant, eccentric woman, The kind of relative you only saw once every few years at awkward family gatherings. I never knew her well. My mother always said she was reclusive, obsessed with strange artifacts and old forgotten things. But when the lawyer called, informing me that Aunt Margaret had left me her entire collection of antique dolls, I was speechless. At first I thought it was some kind of joke. What would I possibly do with a collection of creepy old dolls? I had never even known Aunt Margaret to have dolls, let alone a full collection of them. Nevertheless, they were now mine, and soon a shipment arrived at my doorstep. There were over 20 dolls, each one packed carefully in individual wooden crates, all of them covered in dust, their once bright dresses faded with age. I couldn't deny that they were beautiful, handcrafted, with delicate features and clothing that looked like it belonged to another time. But there was something unsettling about them too. Maybe it was the eyes, glassy, unblinking, the kind of eyes that seemed to follow you around the room no matter where you stood. I unpacked them reluctantly, placing them on shelves in the guest room. It was the only room with enough space to store them. I figured I would sell them later. Maybe some collector of oddities would be interested, but for now, they would stay in the house. At the time, I didn't know how much I would come to regret that decision. The first night was quiet. I went to bed, thinking little of the dolls. They were just objects, after all. What harm could they do? But in the middle of the night, something woke me. A sound. At first I thought it was the wind rattling through the old windows of the house, but as I lay there, listening, I realized it wasn't the wind. It was a voice. Whispers. Faint, almost too quiet to hear, but unmistakably voices. I sat up in bed, my heart beginning to pound. The sound was coming from the guest room, from the room where the dolls were. I shook my head, trying to clear the grogginess of sleep. I must have been imagining it. The house was old. Old houses made noises in the night. I lay back down, pulling the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was nothing. But the whispers didn't stop. They grew louder, more persistent. And then I heard something else. Laughter. A soft, childish giggle that sent shivers down my spine. The next morning, I tried to convince myself that the sounds had been part of some strange dream. But when I opened the door to the guest room, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The dolls sat exactly where I had left them, their glassy eyes staring ahead, but there was a stillness in the room that felt heavy, suffocating. I stood in the doorway for a moment, feeling like I was intruding on something I shouldn't be. Finally, I closed the door and went about my day, determined to forget the night before. But that night, the whispers came again. This time they were louder, clearer. I could make out individual words, fragmented sentences spoken in high-pitched, childlike voices. "Help me. Please, let me out. It hurts." I bolted upright in bed, my pulse racing. It felt like the room was closing in around me, the whispers growing louder until they seemed to echo in my skull. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the flashlight from my nightstand and stormed into the guest room. The whispers stopped the moment I opened the door. I stood in the doorway, my breath coming in ragged gasps, shining the flashlight over the shelves of dolls. Nothing moved, but there was a coldness in the air, a deep, unnatural chill that seemed to seep into my bones. And then, as I turned to leave, I saw it. One of the dolls had shifted. I was sure of it. When I had first unpacked them, all of the dolls had been facing forward, their lifeless eyes staring blankly into space. But now, one of them, the one in the pale blue dress, was turned slightly to the side, its head tilted, as if it were looking at me. A wave of nausea rolled over me. I stumbled back, my legs weak, and slammed the door shut behind me, my heart racing. The following day, I decided to do some research. There had to be a logical explanation for what I was experiencing. Stress, maybe, or lack of sleep. But something about the dolls wouldn't let me rest. I needed to know more. I found an old letter in one of the crates, tucked away beneath the dolls. It was yellowed with age, the handwriting delicate and neat. The letter was addressed to my great-aunt Margaret, and it was from an antique dealer. The letter described the dolls as part of a rare collection, handcrafted by a 19th century doll maker named Victor Reinhardt. According to the letter, Reinhardt had been a notorious figure in his time, accused of a series of brutal murders. He had been a surgeon by trade, but his true passion had been creating dolls, grotesque, lifelike dolls that he claimed were art in its purest form. The letter went on to explain that Reinhardt had been convicted of killing at least a dozen women, all of whom had disappeared under mysterious circumstances. The bodies were never found, but rumours swirled that he had used his victims in his creations, somehow trapping their souls inside the dolls. The authorities had never been able to prove it, and Reinhardt had been executed in 1875. I felt a chill crawl up my spine as I read the final line of the letter. It is said that the souls of Reinhardt's victims remain trapped within the dolls, forever bound to their delicate porcelain faces. That night the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. I lay in bed, my hands clenched in fists, trying to drown out the sound. But it was no use. The voices wouldn't stop. And then I heard it again. Laughter. That same childish giggle, echoing through the dark. I couldn't take it anymore. I threw the blankets aside and stormed into the guest room, flicking on the light. The dolls sat there, staring at me with their lifeless eyes. But I knew now that they weren't just dolls. They were something else, something evil. As I stood there, glaring at them, one of the dolls, the one in the pale blue dress, slowly turned its head to face me. I screamed, stumbling backward, nearly tripping over my own feet. The doll's glassy eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I heard a voice, clear, cold, and filled with malice. "He's coming for you." I locked the door to the guest room that night, hoping to contain whatever evil lurked within. But the whispers followed me. No matter where I went in the house, I could hear them, soft, murmuring voices, telling me things I didn't want to hear. The next day, I found out that my neighbour had died. Mrs. Lawrence, a sweet old woman who lived 2 houses down, had been found dead in her kitchen. The police said it was a heart attack, but there was something about it that didn't sit right with me. The timing felt wrong, too convenient. That night, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. The dolls were speaking to me, recounting the details of Mrs. Lawrence's death, describing the way she had clutched her chest, gasping for air, her eyes wide with terror. I knew then that it wasn't a heart attack that had killed her. It was the dolls. They were telling me how they had done it. I became obsessed after that. I spent every waking moment trying to unravel the mystery of the dolls to find a way to stop them. But no matter what I did, the whispers wouldn't stop. The dolls grew more active, shifting positions when I wasn't looking, their heads turning to watch me as I moved through the house. And then, the deaths started piling up. First it was Mrs. Lawrence. Then it was my friend Claire who had come to visit me one evening. We were having tea in the living room when I excused myself to use the bathroom. When I came back, Claire was slumped over in her chair, her eyes wide and unblinking, her skin cold and pale. The dolls whispered to me that night, telling me how they had killed her, how they had reached into her chest and stopped her heart. I tried to run. I packed a bag and fled to a hotel, hoping that I could escape the voices, but it was no use. The dolls were with me now, and they would follow me wherever I went. I returned to the house, my mind unraveling. The dolls greeted me with their whispers, their voices now a constant presence in my head. They spoke of more deaths, deaths that hadn't happened yet. And then I realized what they were telling me. I was next. I don't know how long I have left. The dolls are watching me now, their glassy eyes following my every move. The whispers have grown louder, more insistent, telling me that my time is running out. They want me. They want my soul. I can hear them now, just outside the door, their tiny hands scratching at the wood, their voices chanting in unison. He's coming for you. And soon, I will be one of them, Will.
The collector. It's the smell that I'll never forget. It hangs in the air like a ghostly presence, an odd mix of damp earth, decay, and something metallic like rusted iron. It clings to everything here in this suffocating little town that I had the misfortune of moving to. Greystone is its name, a place that barely exists on any map, nestled deep in the valley, perpetually blanketed by mist. The few locals I'd seen in my first days here were tight-lipped and avoided eye contact, shuffling about like shadows in the fog. The houses seemed to sag under some invisible weight, their paint peeling, windows staring out like hollow eyes. It was exactly the sort of place I needed. At least that's what I thought at the time. A fresh start, a way to bury the past and all the mistakes that came with it. I hadn't realized then that this town would become my prison, or that I would be caught in the web of something far older and more dangerous than my own guilty conscience. I had rented a small cottage on the edge of town, not far from the woods. The first night was unsettling, but nothing I couldn't chalk up to the unfamiliar creaks and groans of an old house settling into its bones. But by the third night, the dreams began. At first they were vague, fleeting images of shadowy figures moving through the fog. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding, but with no memory of what exactly had frightened me. Then, as the days wore on, the dreams became more vivid, more deliberate. Each night I dreamt of a man. His face was always obscured by darkness, but his presence loomed over me like a heavy cloak. I could feel him watching me, waiting for something, and I knew, deep down, that he wasn't just a figment of my imagination. I had heard the locals whispering about him in the dim light of the pub, though they would fall silent the moment they noticed me listening. But I caught enough words to piece together fragments of their conversations. They called him the Collector, a name that sent a shiver down my spine every time it was mentioned. No one ever spoke directly about what he did, but it was clear that people feared him, feared what he represented, death or worse. The pub was always filled with tension. The bartender, a burly man with graying hair, was the only person willing to engage with me, though even his friendliness was strained. I tried to ask him about the town, about its history, but he would only grunt in response. One night after a few drinks, I pressed him harder. "You've been here a long time, right? You must know about the rumors, about the Collector." His face darkened instantly. He wiped his hands on a rag, leaned in close and lowered his voice. "You don't ask about him," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Not unless you want to be next. People die here when it's their time. Don't go looking for answers you don't want to find." With that, he turned away, refusing to speak further. But I couldn't let it go. Not now. I had come to Greystone to hide from my own demons. But it seemed the town had its own demons as well, and they were more real than I could have ever imagined. A week passed and the dreams worsened. Each night I saw him, the Collector. His figure stood taller and clearer with each passing night, his presence a constant shadow on the periphery of my vision. He never moved, never spoke. He only watched. His silhouette was blurred like a smudge on a camera lens, but his eyes, those dark, hollow eyes, pierced through me every time. I would wake up gasping for air, drenched in cold sweat, heart pounding in my chest as though it were trying to escape. Sleep deprivation began to take its toll. I found myself wandering through the town aimlessly during the day, watching the fog roll in thicker and faster with each passing morning. The townspeople avoided me now. They knew I was asking too many questions. They could feel the curse settling in around me, just as I did. Yet no matter how hard I tried to stop thinking about him, I couldn't. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I decided to dig deeper. If the collector was real, and if the town feared him as much as I was beginning to, I needed to know why. So I started going through town records. Late at night, I visited the small, dusty library, its wooden shelves creaking beneath the weight of forgotten knowledge. That's where I found it. A file tucked away in the corner of the archives. It wasn't much, just a few old newspaper clippings and some handwritten notes that had yellowed with age. The headlines were vague, mentions of strange deaths, disappearances, and odd symbols carved into the victims' bodies. Some articles dated back over 100 years. There was one that particularly caught my attention. Ritualistic killing shocks town. Local man found with symbols carved into flesh. The article described a young man, Jonathan Carmichael, who had been found mutilated at the edge of the forest in 1992. His body was marked with strange symbols, symbols that no one could identify. The case remained unsolved. But the article mentioned that similar deaths had occurred before, in intervals of about 5 to 7 years. Every time, a different person. Always gruesome, always unexplainable. I stared at the newspaper, my stomach knotting. This wasn't just a rumor. It was real. The collector was real, and he had been claiming lives in Greystone for over a century. The dates didn't lie, and the symbols, those same symbols were appearing in my dreams, scrawled in the air around the collector's shadowy figure. I was being marked. I didn't know why, but I knew I was next. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My mind raced, trying to rationalize, trying to find a way out. But the more I thought about it, the clearer it became. This was no ordinary curse. This wasn't a man hunting for victims at random. The collector took only those who were burdened by something, people with deep, hidden sins. And that's when the guilt came crashing down on me. You see, I hadn't moved to Greystone for a fresh start. I had come here to hide, to run from what I had done. I thought if I left the city, if I buried myself in this foggy little town, no one would ever know. No one would find out about the accident. It was raining that night, the night it happened. I was driving too fast, coming back from a party where I had more than a few drinks. I didn't see him. A kid, no more than 16. He ran out into the road and I hit him. The impact was sickening, the thud of his body against the hood of my car still echoing in my ears. I panicked. I was drunk, my license already suspended. If anyone found out, I'd be ruined. So I did the unthinkable. I left him there on the side of the road, and I drove away. I didn't even look back. For months I had tried to convince myself it was a horrible mistake, an accident. But the guilt gnawed at me, festering like an open wound. It was that guilt that had driven me to Greystone, hoping I could outrun it. But I couldn't. The collector knew. He always knew. The night I found the mark on my door was the night everything changed. It was crude, barely noticeable at first, like a smudge of dirt or paint. But when I looked closer, I saw it for what it was. A symbol etched into the wood with a precision that was chilling. It matched the symbols I had seen in the newspaper articles, the same ones that adorned the bodies of the collector's victims. Panic set in. My breath came in short, ragged gasps. I grabbed my keys, throwing whatever I could into a bag. I wasn't going to wait around for him to come for me. I had to leave, now. But when I tried to drive out of town, the fog was thicker than ever. The road twisted and turned in ways it hadn't before, the mist swallowing up the headlights until I could barely see a few feet ahead. I drove for hours, my knuckles white against the steering wheel, but every turn, every road led me back to the cottage. It was as if Greystone itself wouldn't let me leave. In the end, it didn't matter. The collector doesn't care about distance. He doesn't care about running. He is patient. He waits until you're too tired to fight, too exhausted to flee. Then he comes for you. That night I locked myself in the house. I barricaded the doors, pulled the curtains shut, and waited. The fog pressed against the windows like a living thing, swirling and writhing as if it knew what was about to happen. The silence was suffocating, broken only by the distant rustling of leaves outside. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. But it didn't matter. Whether I was awake or asleep, he was there, watching. At 3 a.m., the first knock came. It was soft, almost polite, but it sent a jolt of terror through my body. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The second knock was louder, more insistent. I crawled to the door, every nerve in my body screaming at me to stay still, to pretend I wasn't there. But it was too late. The third knock was deafening, rattling the door on its hinges. And then, silence. I waited, heart pounding in my chest, every second feeling like an eternity. Slowly, cautiously, I peered through the peephole. He was there. The collector stood in the mist, his face obscured by shadows, but I knew it was him. I could feel it. The overwhelming presence of guilt, of judgment, pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't bear. His eyes, black as the void, stared into mine. I didn't scream. I didn't run. I simply opened the door. The last thing I remember before the darkness consumed me was the cold, metallic scent of blood filling the air. The next morning, they found my body in the woods. Torn apart, my skin marked with the same symbols that had been carved into every victim before me. The townspeople didn't speak of it, just as they hadn't spoken of the others. Life in Greystone would go on, and in a few years, the collector would come again, drawn by the sins of another. And so it goes.
The shadow, behind the door. It began so innocently. I had moved into my new house only 2 weeks ago, a modest place in a quiet suburban neighborhood, nothing out of the ordinary. I was looking for peace, a fresh start after the breakup and the stress of my job as a paralegal. I thought that maybe a change of scenery, a new space would help me reset. But I could never have imagined how wrong I was, how deeply wrong everything would go. The house was charming in its own way, with its old creaky floors and small backyard that was perfect for gardening. It was one of those places that didn't scream for attention but held a certain warmth about it. It was mine, and for the first few days, everything seemed perfect. But then, I started noticing the shadows. At first I thought it was just my eyes playing tricks on me. I would open a door and catch a glimpse of something, a movement, a flicker just beyond the edge of the door frame. The kind of thing that made you stop for a second and look back, squinting to see if there was anything really there. But nothing ever was. Just nerves, I told myself. It was a new house, the unfamiliar spaces, the different angles of light. Surely that's all it was. Besides, I had always been a little jumpy, always thinking I saw things out of the corner of my eye, only to laugh at myself a second later. But this was different. One evening, as I opened the door to my bedroom, I saw it again. The shadow. This time, it didn't disappear right away. It lingered. It clung to the space just behind the door like an oil slick, unnatural and wrong. My stomach twisted into knots as I watched it, hoping it would fade, but it didn't. I closed the door quickly, my heart racing. What the hell was that? I muttered to myself, pressing my back against the door, as if whatever was on the other side could sense my fear. I didn't sleep much that night. Every creak of the house, every shift in the shadows from the streetlight outside made my heart race. But eventually, I convinced myself that it was nothing. Maybe a shadow from the tree outside, or maybe just my nerves again. After all, moving was stressful. It could mess with your head. That's what I wanted to believe. The next morning, I had almost forgotten about the incident. I went about my routine, coffee, emails, a quick jog around the neighborhood. Life returned to normal, or at least it tried to. But then it happened again. I was opening the closet door in the hallway to grab my jacket when I saw it. A dark, misshapen shadow. This time, it moved. I saw it, clear as day, slipping away from the door's edge, as if it were retreating into the walls. My hand froze on the doorknob, my breath caught in my throat. "What the hell?" I whispered, stepping back from the closet, my heart thudding in my chest. I closed the door slowly, almost reverently, as if whatever was behind it could somehow reach out and grab me if I moved too quickly. I stood there for a long time, staring at the door, trying to make sense of what I had seen. It didn't make sense. The shadow, it wasn't just a trick of the light. I had seen it move. It wasn't natural. The next few days were worse. The shadow kept appearing behind every door I opened. Sometimes it would be faint, a quick flicker of movement. Other times it would stay longer, lingering as if it were watching me, waiting for something. I stopped opening doors unless I absolutely had to. It felt ridiculous, but I couldn't help the fear that gnawed at me every time I reached for a doorknob. I tried telling myself it wasn't real. I tried to push the thought out of my mind. But how could I ignore it when it was everywhere? Every door, every time. One night, I had just stepped out of the shower when I saw it again, this time in the bathroom mirror. The bathroom door had been open just a crack, and there it was, the shadow, stretching out from behind the door, like some grotesque figure slinking closer. My reflection seemed to flicker as the shadow loomed, and for a moment, I swore I could feel its cold presence pressing in around me. I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in ragged gasps. This was no trick of the light. This thing, it was real. I confided in my friend Jessica the next day over coffee. I had debated telling her at all, fearing she'd think I was losing it, but I had to tell someone. "Shadows," she said, raising an eyebrow. "Like creepy shadows, or just normal shadows?" "Not normal," I insisted, gripping my coffee cup tighter. "It moves, Jess. It's always there when I open a door. I don't know how to explain it, but I think it's following me." She chuckled, trying to brush it off. "You've been stressed. I mean, it's a new place, right? Maybe it's just your mind playing tricks on you." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But deep down, I knew something was horribly wrong. Still, I smiled and nodded, pretending to be reassured by her words. That night, I came home to find a dark shape by the front door. I froze. For a split second, I thought it was a person, a tall, slender figure standing in the dim light of the hallway. But when I blinked, it was gone. Just a shadow again. My heart pounded in my chest as I walked through the house, every door an unbearable weight on my shoulders. Every time I opened one, I dreaded what I might see, the dark mass, the unnatural form, the thing that was now stalking me. And then the killing started. It was Jessica. I found out through a frantic phone call from one of our mutual friends. She had been found in her apartment, brutally murdered. The police wouldn't release details, but from the little I heard, it wasn't a normal killing. Her body had been mutilated. I felt sick. The last time I had seen her, I had been telling her about the shadow, about the thing that followed me. And now she was dead. The guilt was overwhelming. I couldn't shake the thought that somehow I had caused this. That maybe the shadow wasn't just following me, it was killing for me. The shadows grew bolder after Jessica's death. I would see them in broad daylight, slipping through doorways, crawling along the floor, inching closer every time I opened a door. The air in the house felt heavier, thick with tension and dread. I tried to stay out as much as possible, visiting friends, going for long walks, anything to avoid the house. But every time I returned, the shadows were there, waiting. I started locking doors, but it didn't matter. I could feel them behind the wood, scratching, whispering. They were inside, part of the house now. I was trapped with them, and I knew deep down that it was only a matter of time before they took me too. The whispers began soon after. Soft at first, barely audible, like a distant conversation just out of reach. But they grew louder, more insistent, until I could hear them clearly whenever I was near a door. "Open it," they would say, their voices dry and cracked like old parchment. "Open the door!" I refused. I barricaded myself in the bedroom, desperate to keep the doors shut. But the whispering never stopped. More people died. My neighbor, an old woman who lived across the street, was found dead in her garden. My boss, a middle-aged man who had always been kind to me, was killed in a hit-and-run that had no explanation. Every time someone died, I had seen the shadow that day. I had opened a door. It was me. The shadow was following me, killing everyone around me, and I had no way to stop it. One night, after a particularly long day of trying to outrun the shadow, I returned home to find my bedroom door open. Panic surged through me. I hadn't left it open. I was certain. I stood there, frozen, staring at the gaping doorway. The whispers began again, louder now, more urgent. "Open the door! Open it!" I stepped forward, my hand shaking as I reached for the knob. I didn't want to, but it was like something was pulling me, guiding me toward it. My heart pounded in my chest, my throat dry as I turned the handle. On the other side, I saw nothing at first, just the familiar room, bathed in the dim glow of the bedside lamp. But then the shadows moved. They shifted, coiling like smoke, twisting into the shape of something vaguely human. It stood there, in the corner, staring at me with hollow eyes. And for the first time, the shadow spoke directly to me. "You brought me here." I backed away, my mind reeling. The shadow advanced, slow, deliberate, as though savoring my fear. "You let me in." I shook my head, tears stinging my eyes. "No, I didn't. I didn't mean to." "Every door you opened, you brought me closer," it hissed, the words slithering through the air like poison. I realized then that the shadow had been using me from the start, latching onto me, feeding off my fear, killing those I loved. And now, it wanted me. I turned and ran, slamming the door behind me, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But I knew it was only a matter of time before it found me again. The shadow was part of the house now, part of me. I locked myself in the bathroom, my hands trembling as I barricaded the door with anything I could find. But there was only one door left. One door between me and the shadow. The whispers grew louder. "Open the door!" I pressed my back against the cold tiles, trying to block out the voices. But the door rattled on its hinges, the shadows crawling through the cracks, slithering toward me. Open the door. There was no escape. I was trapped, cornered, with only one way out. I had to open the door, or starve. The decision was no longer mine. In the end, I did open the door. And as the shadow enveloped me, its cold, dark tendrils wrapping around my body, I realized it had never been about me escaping. It had been waiting for me to bring it home.
The reflection room. I had always prided myself on being a rational man. After years of schooling, training, and working with patients who had lost their grip on reality, I had learned to keep my feet planted firmly on the ground. Emotions could be chaotic, but my job as a therapist was to guide people back from the edge, to restore order in their fractured minds. That's why, when I was offered a position at Holloway Mental Institution, I didn't hesitate. It was a prestigious facility, known for treating some of the most disturbed minds in the country. I took it as a challenge, a chance to make a real difference with patients no one else could help. I was especially intrigued when they told me about their most infamous resident, a man they called the Mirror Man. His real name was Simon Cole, though most people in the institution referred to him by his chilling nickname. Simon had been convicted of manipulating at least 5 people into committing suicide. But these weren't just ordinary suicides. They were staged. Each victim had killed themselves in front of a mirror, slitting their throats as they stared into their reflection. The cases were bizarre, even by the standards of criminal psychology. Somehow, Simon had convinced his victims that their deaths were the only escape from a fate worse than hell. The media had turned him into a legend, embellishing his ability to make people see their worst selves through mirrors. Now, as his new therapist, it was my job to break through his defenses, to understand how he had done it, and if possible, to treat him. I had no idea what I was walking into. From the moment I arrived at Holloway, I felt the weight of the place. The institution was a massive, cold building with long, sterile hallways and the sharp scent of antiseptic hanging in the air. The lighting was dim, casting long shadows against the walls. Every room was equipped with one-way mirrors, allowing the staff to observe patients without being seen. It gave me an eerie, constant sense of being watched, even when I was alone. The day I met Simon Cole, the tension in the air seemed to thicken. I had seen his file, read about his crimes, but nothing could have prepared me for the man himself. He was sitting in a chair in the middle of a small, windowless room, hands shackled to the armrests, but he appeared relaxed, too relaxed for someone in his situation. His hair was short and neat, his face almost handsome, though his eyes were sharp and cold, like shards of glass. He didn't seem insane. If anything, he exuded a calm confidence that made my skin crawl. "Dr. Harper, I presume," he said as I walked in, his voice smooth as silk. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Cole," I replied, keeping my tone professional, "I've been assigned to your case." Simon chuckled, the sound low and unsettling. "Assigned to fix me, you mean? They think they can change what I am, but that's not going to happen." "I'm not here to change you," I said, sitting down across from him. "I'm here to understand." He tilted his head, watching me with those piercing eyes. "Understand what? How I made those poor souls look into the mirror and see their true selves? Or are you trying to figure out why I haven't done the same to you yet?" A chill ran down my spine, but I didn't let it show. I knew this was part of his game. Simon was a manipulator. He thrived on making people doubt themselves, on unraveling their sanity piece by piece. I wasn't going to let him get to me. "We're just going to talk," I said, leaning forward slightly. "That's all." But Simon didn't respond. Instead, he glanced toward the one-way mirror on the wall, as though he could see through it. "Do you ever wonder," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "if the reflection you see is really you?" I didn't answer. I wasn't sure how to. As the weeks went by, I continued my sessions with Simon. At first they were uneventful. He talked, I listened, and I made notes. But there was always an undercurrent of tension, as if he were testing me, waiting for something. He had an uncanny way of steering our conversations toward uncomfortable topics, things he couldn't possibly know about me. He would mention my past relationships, my childhood, even the death of my mother, all in vague, unsettling terms. "How do you think your mother felt?" he asked one day, when she looked into the mirror for the last time. I had never told anyone about the day I found my mother, slumped over the sink, a bottle of pills spilled out on the counter. The way her lifeless eyes stared at her reflection in the mirror was an image that had haunted me for years. "How do you know about that?" I demanded, my voice sharper than I intended. Simon smiled, but again it didn't reach his eyes. "I see things, Dr. Harper. Mirrors tell stories, you know. If you look deep enough, you'll see everything." I tried to shake it off, but after that day, strange things started happening. It began with the mirrors. The one-way mirrors in the institution, designed for observation, started cracking. Hairline fractures that spider-webbed across the glass without explanation. At first, it was just in Simon's room, but soon I began noticing them in other places. My office, the common areas, even the bathroom mirrors. The cracks grew deeper and more pronounced each day, as though the glass itself were breaking under some unseen pressure. Then came the reflections. It happened the first time when I was brushing my teeth one night. I glanced up at the bathroom mirror, expecting to see my own tired face staring back at me. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. It was me, but not me. My reflection was twisted, distorted. My face was gaunt, my eyes hollow, and my skin pale as death. For a moment I just stood there, frozen, staring at the figure in the glass. Then, as I blinked, the reflection shifted back to normal, and I was left staring at my own face, pale and wide-eyed with shock. I backed away from the mirror, my heart hammering in my chest. It had to be stress. I was overworked, exhausted, and dealing with one of the most manipulative patients I'd ever encountered. But as the days went on, the visions grew worse. I started hearing whispers, Simon's voice, soft and mocking, echoing through the halls when no one else was around. When I checked the observation room mirrors, I would see glimpses of myself, watching from the other side, my reflection smiling in ways I wasn't. The more I tried to ignore it, the stronger it became. Simon's grip on me was tightening, and I didn't know how to fight it. I began having nightmares, horrible, vivid dreams where I stood in front of a mirror, holding a razor blade to my throat, Simon's voice in my ear telling me it was the only way to escape. "Do it, Dr. Harper," he would whisper. "See the truth. You've always known." I would wake up drenched in sweat. The image of my reflection burned into my mind. I tried to talk to my colleagues, but they dismissed my concerns. They thought I was overworked, that the stress of handling Simon's case was getting to me. Maybe they were right. But deep down, I knew something darker was at play. Simon was inside my head, just like he had been inside the heads of his victims. One night, as I walked through the dimly lit hallways of Holloway, I heard something that stopped me cold. It was a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from down the corridor near Simon's room. I approached cautiously, my heart pounding in my chest. The door to his cell was slightly ajar, which was strange. It was supposed to be locked at all times. I pushed it open, the hinges creaking, and stepped inside. Simon was standing in the center of the room, facing the one-way mirror. He wasn't shackled this time. His arms hung loosely at his sides, and he was staring at his own reflection with an intensity that made my skin crawl. "I told you," he said without turning around. "Mirrors tell stories, and you, Dr. Harper, are about to become part of mine." I took a step back, my pulse racing. Something was very wrong. I glanced toward the mirror, expecting to see Simon's reflection staring back at me. But what I saw instead made my blood run cold. It wasn't Simon's reflection. It was mine. I was standing in front of the mirror, holding a razor blade to my throat, just like in my nightmares. But this time, it wasn't a dream. I could feel the cold metal against my skin, the sharp edge digging into my flesh. "You see the truth now, don't you?" Simon's voice echoed in my mind. "You were always going to end up here, Dr. Harper. It's inevitable." I tried to fight it, to pull the blade away, but my body wasn't my own anymore. Simon had control. He had been pulling the strings all along, manipulating me, driving me toward this moment. As the blade sliced across my throat, the last thing I saw was my reflection, twisted, broken, and smiling. They found me the next morning, slumped in front of the mirror, just like Simon's other victims. But Simon was gone. He had manipulated one of the guards into letting him out. By the time they realized what had happened, Simon Cole, the mirror man, had vanished into thin air. There was no sign of him, no trace, no indication of where he might have gone. The only thing they found was my body, lifeless, just another victim of the man who had turned so many into distorted reflections of themselves. When I woke up, if you could call it waking, I found myself in darkness, but it wasn't just any darkness. It was cold, empty, and all-consuming. There was no sound, no sensation, nothing but a faint awareness of being. I tried to move, but I had no body, no limbs to stretch, no hands to feel with. And then gradually I saw it, the dim outline of a mirror. I was trapped inside it. My reflection stared back at me, but it wasn't the version of myself I had once known. The figure in the glass was pale, emaciated, its eyes hollow and filled with a sorrow I couldn't comprehend. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My mouth moved, forming words that I could no longer hear. This was what Simon Cole had done to me. He had made me one of his reflections, a prisoner in the very thing he had used to torment and manipulate his victims. I was no longer a man. I was a shadow, a ghost, forever trapped in the cold, silvered surface of the mirror. Time didn't exist in the place where I now lived. Days, months, maybe even years passed without me knowing. I had no concept of how long I'd been stuck in that reflection, staring out at the world I could never again touch. Sometimes I would see others, doctors, guards, patients, pass by, their faces blurry and indistinct from behind the glass. I tried to call out to them, to tell them what had happened, but they couldn't hear me. I was invisible, just a faint shimmer of a life long extinguished. And then one day I saw him again. Simon Cole. He had come back. It was years after my death, though it could have been days or centuries for all I knew. He looked the same as he had when I last saw him, calm, collected with that cold, calculating smile. I watched, helpless, as he walked into a room I recognized all too well, the reflection room. There was a new therapist now, a young woman, full of optimism and eager to help Simon, just as I had once been. She had no idea what was about to happen to her, no idea that the man sitting across from her was not just a patient, but a predator, feeding off the darkest corners of the mind. I watched as Simon worked his magic, weaving his words into her mind like a slow, creeping poison. I saw her doubt herself, saw the fear flicker in her eyes as he began to tear down the walls of her sanity. She couldn't see me watching from the mirror, but I could feel the pull of the glass, drawing me closer, as though Simon's control extended beyond death itself. And then, as she glanced toward the one-way mirror, I saw her face change. Her eyes widened in horror, and I realized she could see me, my distorted reflection staring back at her, trapped in the silvered surface of the glass. For a moment our gazes locked, and I tried to warn her, tried to scream that she needed to run, to get out while she still could. But it was too late. Simon smiled. He knew I was there. He had known all along. I don't know how many more will come after her. How many more will sit in the reflection room believing they can help Simon Cole, believing they are in control. But I know one thing for sure. I'll be here, watching from the other side, trapped in this endless prison of glass. And every time another poor soul looks into that mirror, they'll see me, the twisted, broken reflection of a man who thought he could fight the darkness, only to become part of it. The mirror man is still out there, still pulling the strings, still turning people's worst fears against them. And as long as he lives, as long as he continues to manipulate and destroy, I'll be trapped here, watching, waiting. But one day, I hope, no, I know, he'll slip. And when he does, I'll be ready. Because even reflections have their revenge.
The face in the fog. I never thought I'd end up in a town like Barrow's Hollow. When I first got the assignment from my editor, I wasn't exactly thrilled. A coastal town with a population barely scraping 500, constantly covered in thick, impenetrable fog. Hardly an ideal setting for someone like me who thrives on big city chaos and breaking news. But something about the town gnawed at my curiosity, something deeper than the cliché of a sleepy coastal village. A string of disappearances had brought me here, locals gone missing one by one over the past few months. And the fog, well, the fog never left. I arrived just after dusk, my car's headlights barely cut through the grey mist that hung like a shroud over everything. As I approached the town, the ocean breeze carried with it a salty dampness that clung to my skin. The fog was so thick that the town itself seemed to materialize out of nowhere, the buildings and streets emerging like ghosts from the sea. The main road was practically empty, save for a few dim streetlights casting long shadows through the haze. Most of the shops were closed, their windows dark and uninviting. Even the pub, which I thought would be a local hangout, was eerily quiet. It felt as though the entire town was holding its breath, waiting for something. I parked in front of a small weathered inn at the edge of town. The sign above the door swung lazily in the misty breeze, the letters barely legible through the grime and rust. I checked in with the innkeeper, a wiry old man who barely spoke, his eyes constantly darting toward the windows as if he expected someone or something to walk through the door at any moment. "Fog's thick tonight," he muttered under his breath as I handed him my credit card. "Yeah, noticed that on the way in," I said, trying to lighten the mood. "Looks like it's here to stay." He didn't laugh. Instead, he gave me a look that sent a chill down my spine. The fog. It doesn't leave. That was all he said before handing me my room key and retreating into the back office, leaving me alone in the dimly lit lobby. I tried to shake off the unease, but something about the way he said it stuck with me. This wasn't just regular coastal fog. There was something wrong about it. But I was here for a job, not ghost stories. I brushed the thought aside and made my way upstairs to my room. The next morning, I set out to start my investigation. Barrow's Hollow looked even more unsettling in the daylight, or what passed for daylight in this place. The fog was omnipresent, clinging to the town like a second skin, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. I wandered through the streets, hoping to find someone who could tell me more about the disappearances. The first person I spoke to was a fisherman down by the docks. He was an old man, his skin leathery and worn from years at sea. He was mending his nets, but his eyes constantly flicked toward the ocean, as if expecting something to rise from the depths. "You've come to ask about the ones that went missing, haven't you?" he said before I could even introduce myself. His voice was hoarse, like he'd spent his life screaming against the wind. "That's right," I replied, pulling out my notebook. "What can you tell me about them?" He shook his head slowly, his hands still working the nets. "There's something in the fog. Has been for as long as I can remember. Most folks don't talk about it, but everyone knows. When the fog gets thick, thicker than usual like now, people start disappearing. No bodies, no clues, just gone. And sometimes people see him." "See who?" I asked, my pen hovering over the page. "The faceless man," the fisherman whispered, his voice trembling. "He's out there in the fog, waiting. They say he's a curse, a killer from long ago who was drowned in the sea. He's been looking for faces ever since." I stared at the old man, my heart beating a little faster. It sounded like a tall tale, one meant to scare outsiders. But the way he spoke, the fear in his eyes, made me hesitate. "And you've seen him?" I asked. The fisherman paused, then nodded slowly. "Once, a long time ago, when I was just a boy, he was standing there at the edge of the dock watching me. I couldn't see his face because, well, he didn't have one. Just a blank, smooth skin where a face should have been. I ran and never looked back." He fell silent after that, his eyes drifting back toward the fog-covered sea. The more I dug into the town's history, the more disturbing stories I uncovered. Barrow's Hollow had a dark past, one that stretched back centuries. In the early 1800s, there had been a series of brutal murders in the town. The killer, a man named Elias Fenton, had been a fisherman by trade, but his true passion had been taking lives. He'd butchered his victims, removing their faces in some twisted ritual, believing that he could steal their identities. The townspeople eventually caught him and, in a fit of rage, tied him to a heavy stone and threw him into the sea during a violent storm. But his death didn't end the terror. For years afterward, there had been sightings of a figure walking through the fog, faceless, just as the fisherman had described. Every time the fog thickened, someone would disappear. No bodies were ever found, just empty homes and silent streets. I didn't want to believe it. It sounded too fantastical, too rooted in legend. But as I spent more time in Barrow's Hollow, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. It was a few nights later when I saw him for the first time. I had been working late, poring over old newspaper clippings in my room at the inn. The fog outside had thickened, pressing against the windows like it was alive, swirling in strange patterns that made my skin crawl. I stood up to stretch, glancing out the window. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, the fog playing games with my tired eyes, but then I saw it, a figure standing in the street, half hidden by the mist. Tall, with broad shoulders, the figure didn't move. He just stood there, staring up at my window. My breath caught in my throat as I realized what I was seeing. He had no face, just a blank smooth surface where his eyes, nose and mouth should have been. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering in my chest. When I looked again, he was gone, swallowed by the fog. I tried to tell myself it was a hallucination, a product of exhaustion and stress. But deep down, I knew better. The faceless man was real, and he had seen me. From that night on, things changed. I couldn't escape the feeling that he was following me. Every time I stepped outside, I could feel his presence, just at the edge of my vision, lurking in the fog. I would catch glimpses of him through alleyways, reflected in windows, always standing just far enough away that I couldn't be sure if it was really him or just my imagination. But I knew. He was there. The worst part was the mirrors. One morning I was shaving in the bathroom when I noticed something strange. My reflection didn't seem right. The face staring back at me wasn't quite mine. It was as if the features were blurring, fading. I blinked, shaking my head, but when I looked again, my reflection was normal. But it happened again, and again. Every time I looked into a mirror, my face seemed less distinct, as though it were slowly being erased. The fog grew thicker with each passing day, enveloping the town in a suffocating embrace. People continued to disappear. I would hear whispers at the pub. Someone's cousin didn't come home from their fishing trip. Someone's sister hadn't been seen in days. And all the while, the faceless man was there, watching from the shadows. Desperation set in. I had to find out how to stop him. I went back to the fisherman, hoping for answers. His face was pale, his hands trembling as he spoke. "There's no stopping him," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. "Once he's seen you, it's too late. He'll take your face, just like he's taken the others. There must be something I can do," I insisted, my voice rising in panic. The fisherman shook his head. "The sea cursed him, and now he's cursed us all. You can't run from him, you can't hide. He'll take your face, and when he does, no one will remember you." I returned to the inn, my mind racing. I had to leave. I had to get out of Barrow's Hollow before it was too late. But as I packed my bag, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror. My face was gone. It wasn't just fading now. It was completely gone. My skin was smooth, blank, as if someone had wiped away all trace of who I was. I stumbled back, choking on fear. The whispers echoed in my mind. "He's coming for you. He's coming for your face." I ran out of the inn, into the fog-covered streets, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The town was silent, the fog thicker than ever, swirling around me like a living thing. And then I saw him. The faceless man stood in the center of the street, his smooth, blank face reflecting the pale glow of the streetlights. He didn't move. He didn't speak. But I knew what he wanted. He wanted my face. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. The fog pressed in around me, suffocating, as the faceless man stepped forward, his hand outstretched. In that moment I understood. He wasn't just taking faces, he was erasing people, wiping them from existence one by one until no one remembered who they were. And now, it was my turn. I fell to my knees as the fog enveloped me, his hand cold against my skin. And as the world faded into darkness, I knew that soon no one would remember I had ever been here at all. The next day, the fog in Barrow's Hollow lifted slightly, just enough for the sun to peek through. The townspeople went about their lives as they always had, unaware that another soul had been lost to the fog. The innkeeper swept the porch of the inn, pausing for a moment, as if he had forgotten something. He glanced at the empty room upstairs, then shook his head and returned to his work. After all, no one ever stayed at the inn for long, and the fog always took them in the end.
Whispers in the walls. It seemed like a dream come true when I first saw the mansion. A sprawling, abandoned Victorian-era behemoth of stone and iron, sitting alone at the edge of a wooded cliff. It wasn't just any house. It was the kind of place that practically begged to be restored, the kind of place that I thought I could make my own. The realtor had been eager to get rid of it, practically throwing the keys into my hand after I made an offer. They seemed to breathe easier once the deal was closed, like a heavy burden had been lifted from their shoulders. I should have noticed the red flags then, the way they averted their eyes, how their voice dropped when they mentioned the house's history. But I didn't care. I was in love with the idea of the mansion and what it could become once I restored it. The place had once been an asylum long ago. Victorian asylums were infamous for their cruelty, but this one had a particularly grim reputation. It had housed the worst of the worst, criminally insane murderers, sadists, and sociopaths. The thought excited me, oddly enough. There was a kind of morbid charm to the history, a darkness that added character to the sprawling halls and grand staircases. But the excitement faded soon after I moved in. The first night was eerily quiet, the kind of quiet that makes your ears ring, leaving you with an unsettling sense that you're not truly alone. I spent the evening exploring, taking in the musty air and the layers of dust that had settled over every surface. The house felt like it had been frozen in time, faded wallpaper, rotting furniture, chandeliers that hadn't seen light in decades. I loved every inch of it. That night, after hours of exploring, I collapsed into bed in the master bedroom, a massive space with high ceilings and windows that overlooked the fog-covered woods below. I had only just begun to drift off when I heard it, a faint whisper. At first I thought it was the wind. The house groaned and creaked with age, its bones settling after years of neglect. But this was different. This was a voice. I sat up in bed, my heart racing. It was coming from the walls. A soft, almost imperceptible murmur, like someone was speaking from just behind the plaster. I pressed my ear against the wall, straining to make out the words, but they were too faint, too distant. After a few minutes, the whispering stopped, and I convinced myself it had been my imagination, nothing more than the house's old pipes rattling. The next day, I found myself standing in front of a locked door at the far end of the mansion. It hadn't been on the floor plans, and I hadn't noticed it the night before. The wood was scratched and battered, as if someone had tried to claw their way out, or in. Curiosity got the better of me, and I spent hours trying to break the lock. When I finally forced the door open, I found a narrow staircase leading down into a hidden basement. The basement was massive, much larger than I had anticipated. The walls were lined with old medical equipment, the kind you'd expect to see in an 1800s asylum. Rusted chains, iron restraints, and surgical tools that looked more like instruments of torture. I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end as I wandered deeper into the darkness. In one corner I found a door, smaller than the rest, and when I opened it, I found a narrow tunnel, barely wide enough to crawl through. My stomach churned with unease, but I pushed forward, curiosity driving me. The tunnel twisted and turned, leading me into the bowels of the mansion, deeper than I thought possible. At the end of the tunnel, I found a small, windowless room. There were no furnishings, just bare stone walls covered in what looked like scratch marks, hundreds of them, crisscrossing like the desperate attempts of someone trapped inside. But the most disturbing part was the writing. In the dim light of my flashlight, I could see words scratched into the walls, repeated over and over again. "He's here. He's here." The whispers returned that night, louder this time. They seeped through the walls, curling around me in the dark, dragging me from sleep. It wasn't just one voice now. There were dozens, all speaking at once, all whispering the same thing in a frantic, urgent tone. He's here. He's here. I couldn't shake the feeling that the house was trying to tell me something, but I didn't know what. I started spending my days combing through the old records of the asylum, trying to piece together its history. I learned that the mansion had been built as a private facility in the late 1800s by a man named Dr. Elias Blackwell. He had been a prominent doctor at the time, known for his radical and often controversial methods of treating mental illness. But there were rumors about Blackwell, dark rumors. Some said he was more interested in experimenting on his patients than treating them. Others claimed he had a sadistic streak, using the asylum as a cover for his true passion, torture. He had disappeared without a trace in the early 1900s, and shortly after, the asylum was shut down. The more I learned about Blackwell, the more the whispers in the walls seemed to make sense. They weren't the voices of the patients who had died here. They were the voices of his victims. Weeks passed, and the whispers grew more persistent. They no longer waited for nightfall. They followed me through the house, through every room, like an unwanted companion. No matter where I went, they were there, just behind the walls, muttering, urging me to listen. I tried to ignore them at first, but they were relentless. Every time I tried to sleep, the voices would fill my head, growing louder, more insistent. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. The mansion consumed me, and all I could hear were the whispers. He's here. He's here. I don't remember when the hallucinations started. One night I was sitting in the living room, staring at the peeling wallpaper, when I saw him, the shadow of a man, standing in the corner of the room. His face was obscured, his figure tall and menacing. I blinked, and he was gone, but I knew he had been there. I had felt his presence. That's when I realized the whispers weren't just voices. They were calling him. They were calling Dr. Elias Blackwell. The house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, feeding off the madness that had festered within its walls for over a century, and I was its next victim. The following nights became a blur. I would wake up in strange places, rooms I didn't remember entering. My hands were raw, bleeding, as if I had been clawing at the walls in my sleep. The whispers filled every corner of my mind, driving me to the edge of sanity. I started seeing him everywhere, the tall, shadowy figure of Blackwell, watching me from the corners of my vision, always just out of reach. One night, I woke to find myself standing in the basement, the cold stone floor beneath my bare feet. I didn't know how I had gotten there, but I wasn't alone. The shadows twisted and warped around me, and in the dim light, I saw him, Dr. Elias Blackwell, standing in the middle of the room, his face still hidden in shadow. He didn't move, he didn't speak, but I could feel his eyes on me, his presence wrapping around me like a suffocating blanket. The whispers rose to a deafening pitch, the voices screaming in my head. He's here. He's here. They were no longer warnings. They were commands. I don't remember what happened after that night. The next thing I knew, I was waking up in my bed, covered in blood that wasn't my own. My hands were stained red, and there were deep gashes in the walls of the bedroom, as if I had attacked them with a knife. The whispers had stopped, but the house was silent now, unnaturally silent. The kind of silence that feels heavy, oppressive, like the house was holding its breath, waiting for something. And then I heard it. The sound of footsteps, soft, deliberate, coming from the hallway outside my bedroom. I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest, as the footsteps grew closer, stopping just outside the door. For a moment, everything was still. And then, slowly, the door creaked open. Dr. Elias Blackwell stood in the doorway, his face no longer hidden. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets staring straight into my soul. His skin was pale and stretched tightly over his skull, his mouth twisted into a grotesque smile. And then I realized he wasn't a ghost. He wasn't just a figment of my imagination. He was me. I don't know how long I've been here now. Days, weeks, time has lost all meaning. The mansion is mine now. Or perhaps I belong to it. The whispers have returned, but they don't frighten me anymore. They comfort me, guiding me, telling me what to do. I understand now. The house was never alive. It was never feeding off the madness of the asylum's victims. It was feeding off me. And now, it's time to feed it again. I stand in the hallway, my reflection barely recognizable in the cracked mirror. My hands are stained with blood, but I feel no guilt, no remorse. This is who I am now, who I was always meant to be. The whispers tell me that someone new will come to the mansion soon, another person eager to claim this cursed place as their own. But they won't be here for long. No one ever is, because I'll be waiting.
The Blood Moon Ritual. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in Blackwood Hollow, the kind of night I had grown used to in my 28 years of living in this isolated rural town. Nestled in the shadow of the mountains, Blackwood was the type of place people passed through without ever giving it a second thought. For me, it was home, a quiet, predictable place where everyone knew everyone, where the most excitement we ever had was a church bake sale or a town hall meeting about the local wildlife. But that all changed when the blood moon came. The first time I heard about the blood moon, I was a kid, maybe 7 or 8 years old. My grandfather, a stern man who rarely spoke of anything outside of farm work and weather, had taken me aside one evening and whispered a warning. When the moon turns red, you stay inside, Isaac. You don't look out the window. You don't answer the door. You hear me? At the time, I thought he was just trying to scare me. He never explained why, but the look in his eyes had been enough to send a shiver down my spine. There was a fear there, a real bone-deep terror that I didn't understand. And when I asked my parents about it, they just shrugged and said my grandfather had always been a bit superstitious. But still, they never let me out on the nights of the blood moon. Over time, I forgot about it. The blood moon was rare, and nothing ever seemed to happen when it came. People stayed indoors, sure, but that was more out of tradition than fear. Or so I thought. Until this year. It started a few weeks before the blood moon was due. I was working at the local mechanic's shop, fixing up an old truck, when I noticed something strange. There was a symbol scratched into the side of the vehicle's frame. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. It looked like some kind of ancient rune, a circle with jagged lines radiating outward like a sun. I didn't think much of it at first, figuring it was just some random graffiti. But then I started seeing the symbol everywhere, on the side of barns, carved into tree trunks, even etched into the dirt along the road leading out of town. It was subtle, but once you knew what to look for, you couldn't escape it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked some of the old-timers at the bar about it one night. They were a tight-lipped bunch, but when I mentioned the symbol, the room went eerily silent. Even the bartender, who was usually all too happy to gossip, avoided my gaze. Finally, one of the men, Henry, a local farmer, cleared his throat. "Best not ask about that," he muttered, his voice low. "It's nothing you need to worry about, Isaac." I pressed him, but he wouldn't say more. The others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, glancing at each other with looks that made my skin crawl. They knew something, and whatever it was, they were afraid of it. The blood moon was fast approaching, and the strange occurrences in town only grew worse. People were acting differently, more secretive, more on edge. It was subtle, but I noticed the way conversations would die as soon as I entered a room. The way people would glance over their shoulders, whispering in hushed tones. And then came the dreams. They started as flashes, quick, disjointed images of fire, of blood, of something vast and dark lurking just beyond the edge of sight. But as the blood moon grew closer, the dreams became more vivid, more terrifying. I saw people in robes, standing in a circle, chanting in a language I couldn't understand. In the center of the circle was an altar, old and worn, stained with something dark. And above it all, The blood moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a crimson hue. I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. But the worst part wasn't the dreams. It was the feeling that they weren't just dreams, that they were showing me something real. A few days before the blood moon, I found the symbol again, this time carved into the front door of my house. It was deeper than the others, etched with purpose. Someone had been there. Someone had marked me. Panic clawed at my throat as I stared at the carving, the weight of it pressing down on me like a physical force. Something was very, very wrong in Blackwood Hollow. I spent the rest of the day trying to figure out what to do. Leaving town wasn't an option. Blackwood was remote, and the fog that often rolled in from the mountains made the roads treacherous at night. Even if I could make it out, where would I go? And besides, a part of me knew that whatever was happening, it wouldn't stop just because I left. That night I received a visit from Henry. He showed up at my door looking more haggard than I'd ever seen him. His eyes were bloodshot, his hands trembling as he clutched his hat. "They've chosen you, Isaac," he said, his voice barely a whisper. I stared at him, my stomach churning. Chosen me for what? "The blood moon ritual," he said, his voice breaking. "It's been going on for centuries. Every time the blood moon rises, the town, we offer a sacrifice." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. A sacrifice? To what? Henry looked down, his hands shaking. To the ancient one, the one that protects the town, the one that gave us power, prosperity, but at a price. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. It sounded insane. But the look in Henry's eyes told me it was all too real. "They've marked you," he continued, nodding toward the symbol on my door. "You're the chosen one this time, and there's no escaping it." I slammed the door in Henry's face and paced my living room, my mind racing. A sacrifice? To some ancient god or demon? It couldn't be real. But the fear gnawing at my insides told me otherwise. The blood moon was only 2 days away, and I had to do something. I spent the next day gathering supplies. If they were going to come for me, I wasn't going down without a fight. I packed a bag with food, water, a flashlight, and a hunting knife. Anything I could think of that might help me survive. My plan was to head into the woods and find a place to hide until the blood moon passed. But that night, the dreams returned, more vivid than ever. This time I wasn't just watching the ritual, I was part of it. I saw myself standing on the altar, my hands bound, my body trembling as the cult members circled around me, chanting in their strange language. A figure in a mask, a grotesque, ancient mask of bone and leather, stood at the front of the group, holding a curved dagger that glinted in the moonlight. The blood moon hung low in the sky, casting everything in a sickly red light. The masked figure stepped forward, raising the dagger, and just as the blade came down, I woke up, gasping for air. The day of the blood moon was eerily quiet. The town was empty, the streets deserted. Even the usual sounds of birds and wind through the trees were gone. It was as if the entire world was holding its breath, waiting. As night fell, I grabbed my bag and slipped out the back door, heading toward the woods. The fog had rolled in thick, but I knew these woods like the back of my hand. I could navigate them blind if I had to. But as I moved deeper into the forest, I realized something was wrong. The trees seemed taller, denser than I remembered. The path that I'd walked 100 times before now twisted and turned in ways that made no sense. The fog was thicker here, clinging to my skin, making it hard to breathe. The blood moon hung overhead, casting an eerie red glow through the mist. And then I heard it. Footsteps behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned around, and there, emerging from the fog, were the cult members. They were dressed in dark robes, their faces hidden by hoods, but I could see the glint of their eyes as they moved toward me. Leading them was the masked figure from my dreams. I bolted, crashing through the underbrush, branches tearing at my clothes, my breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how fast I ran, the cult members were always just behind me, their footsteps growing louder, closer. Reality itself seemed to warp around me. The trees twisted into grotesque shapes, the ground beneath my feet shifting and cracking. The blood moon's influence was everywhere, warping the world, trapping me in a maze of shadows and fog. Finally, I stumbled into a clearing, and there it was. The altar, the same one from my dreams, ancient and covered in moss, its surface stained with the blood of those who had come before me. I fell to my knees, my strength gone. The cult members surrounded me, their chanting filling the air. The masked figure stepped forward, holding the curved dagger, just as I had seen in my vision. "You are the chosen one," the figure said, their voice a hollow echo. "The sacrifice to the Ancient One. With your death, the town will thrive for another century." The blade gleamed in the red light of the blood moon, and I braced myself for the end. But then, something strange happened. The masked figure hesitated. The dagger hovered in the air, inches from my chest, and then slowly, they lowered it. "You have been chosen," the figure said again, but this time there was something different in their voice. "Chosen to lead." Before I could react, the cult members grabbed me, pulling me to my feet. They forced the mask into my hands, the weight of it heavy, suffocating. And as I placed it over my face, the truth hit me like a tidal wave. I wasn't the sacrifice. I was the next leader. The ritual was never about dying, it was about becoming. The mask, the power, the immortality, it was mine now. And as I stood there, looking out at the robed figures kneeling before me, I understood what I had to do. The blood moon would rise again, and when it did, I would be the one holding the dagger. The cycle had continued, just as it always had. The Ancient One demanded blood, and I would deliver. As the fog closed in around us, I smiled beneath the mask. Blackwood Hollow would be safe for another century, but at what cost?
The beast beneath the floorboards. When I first saw the house, it looked perfect. It was an old Victorian-style home on the outskirts of a quiet, small town, exactly the kind of place I needed after everything fell apart in the city. My breakup, the stress of work, all of it had weighed on me for months, and I was desperate for an escape. The house was just the right amount of fixer-upper, enough character to feel warm and lived in, but in need of a little TLC. I thought, this is where I'll rebuild. This is where I'll start over. The moment I walked through the front door, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, and I laughed. Creaky floors were part of the charm, I told myself. I didn't mind a little noise. But the sounds weren't just the house settling. The first night was peaceful enough. I unpacked a few boxes, made myself some tea, and curled up on the couch with a book. I was exhausted from the move and quickly fell asleep. It was well after midnight when I woke up to a soft, repetitive sound. It was faint at first, almost like the rustling of leaves or a soft tapping. I sat up, listening. The house was still, but the noise continued, coming from below me, tap, tap, tap. I blinked the sleep from my eyes and tried to locate the source. It seemed to be coming from the floor, just beneath the living room. I got up, crossed the room slowly, and pressed my ear to the floorboards. Nothing. I stayed like that for a moment, half expecting something to happen. But the sound stopped, leaving only the deep silence of the house. I shook it off. Old houses creak, I told myself. Probably some kind of rodent in the walls. I'd have to call an exterminator in the morning. But as I climbed back into bed, a gnawing unease settled in my chest. The following day, I called the local exterminator. A man named Bill showed up a few hours later. He was a wiry older man with a thick mustache and a toolbox that looked as old as the house itself. After explaining the sounds I'd heard, he nodded and went to work, checking the crawl spaces, the attic and the foundation. After a few hours, he came back, wiping his hands on a rag. "Found a few droppings, but nothing serious," he said. "Might just be an old nest. I'll set some traps, but I wouldn't worry too much." I thanked him and tried to put the strange noises out of my mind. But that night, the tapping returned. Louder this time, more insistent. It was like something, or someone, was beneath the floor trying to get out. The following week, the tapping escalated into scratching. By this point, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard it. The sharp, desperate scraping coming from beneath the house. It sounded like nails on wood, like something was trying to claw its way up through the floorboards. I called Bill again, and this time he seemed more concerned. He brought bigger traps, more gear, and spent longer in the basement. When he came up, he had a puzzled look on his face. "There's some old damage down there," he said. "Looks like something's been chewing at the foundation. But I didn't see any animals. Could be an old infestation that never got dealt with properly." "But I hear it every night," I insisted. "It's getting worse." Bill just shrugged. "I'll set up some cameras, see if we catch anything." I agreed, though something about his uncertainty unsettled me. Why didn't he seem more alarmed? What was causing that scratching? That night, I couldn't sleep. The scratching had stopped, but in its place was something much worse, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise up through the walls. It was a rumble, like a distant growl, vibrating through the floorboards and into my bones. I didn't go to bed. Instead, I sat in the living room, clutching a mug of tea that had long gone cold, and listened. Whatever was under the house wasn't a rodent. It wasn't something I could just ignore. And as much as I wanted to, I couldn't bring myself to go down into the basement to check. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. At first, they were faint, barely distinguishable from the usual creaks of the old house, but soon they grew louder, more deliberate, like someone, or something, was walking directly beneath me. My blood ran cold as the footsteps moved across the floor, beneath the living room towards the front door. I stood up, my heart hammering in my chest, and without thinking, I grabbed the flashlight Bill had left behind. My hand trembled as I walked toward the door to the basement. I wasn't sure what I was doing. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to leave, but something kept pulling me toward the source of the noise. The basement was cold, far colder than I expected, and the air smelled damp and musty. The stairs creaked under my weight as I descended, the beam of my flashlight flickering against the stone walls. The floor was covered in dust, and the old foundation beams loomed like the ribs of a great beast holding the house above. At first, everything seemed normal. The basement was empty, save for a few old boxes and the equipment Bill had left behind. But as I walked deeper into the shadows, I noticed something strange. There was a door at the far end of the basement, a door I hadn't noticed before. It was small, almost hidden behind a stack of rotting wooden crates. The door was made of thick, heavy wood, and the edges were worn with age. There was no handle, just a large iron keyhole. I knelt down and peered through the hole, shining my flashlight inside. Nothing but darkness. My stomach twisted as I stood up. I couldn't explain it, but something about that door filled me with dread. The air around it felt wrong, colder than the rest of the basement. And as I backed away, I thought I heard something moving on the other side. A faint, shuffling sound, like someone dragging their feet across the floor. That night, the dreams began. I saw the house, but it was different, older. There were people there, men in dark coats, moving through the halls, carrying lanterns and tools. In the center of the room stood a tall man, his face obscured by shadows, but his presence radiated power. He was speaking to someone, a woman, I think, but I couldn't make out what he was saying. And then I saw it. The floorboards in the dream began to lift, as though something underneath was trying to push its way up. I watched in horror as long, gnarled fingers, too thin and too long to be human, clawed their way through the wood. And then the creature emerged. It was a grotesque thing, part human, part animal, its body twisted and malformed. Its eyes were hollow, deep black pits, and its mouth was filled with jagged teeth. It crawled out of the floor, its body contorted in unnatural ways, and the man, the one in the shadows, smiled. I woke up screaming, drenched in sweat. The next morning, I did what I should have done from the beginning. I went to the library and started researching the history of the house. It didn't take long to find what I was looking for. The house had belonged to a man named Elijah Harker, a doctor who had moved to the town in the early 1900s. He had been well respected at first, known for his work treating the town's sick. But rumours began to spread that Harker was involved in something darker, something unholy. According to the old records, people in the town had started disappearing. First, it was drifters and travellers passing through, then it was locals, patients who had been under Harker's care. The disappearances were never solved, but the townspeople had their suspicions. Harker had been conducting strange experiments, they said, dark rituals. And beneath the house, he had created something that shouldn't exist. The final piece of the puzzle came in the form of a journal entry from one of Harker's former assistants, who had fled the town before the disappearances started. The journal detailed Harker's obsession with immortality, his belief that he could merge human and beast, creating a creature that would live forever by consuming the flesh of others. I felt sick as I read the final line of the journal. I fear Harker has succeeded. The thing beneath the house, it is hungry and it waits. That night, I locked every door in the house, every window, and tried to stay awake. But the moment I closed my eyes, I heard it again. The scratching beneath the floorboards, the low guttural growl that reverberated through the house. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But every time I tried to pack my things, the sounds would grow louder, more aggressive. The creature beneath the floor was awake now, and it was coming for me. As I stood in the living room, frantically throwing things into a suitcase, the floor beneath me began to tremble. I froze, my breath catching in my throat, as I felt the wood shift beneath my feet. And then, with a loud crack, the floorboards split open. A clawed hand emerged, covered in dirt and blood, its fingers curling around the edge of the broken floor. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest, as the creature pulled itself up from the darkness below. It was just as I had seen in my dreams, twisted, monstrous, its body a grotesque blend of human and beast. Its eyes locked onto mine, hollow and hungry. I ran. I didn't know where I was going, but I knew I couldn't stay. The creature was right behind me, its breath hot on the back of my neck as I raced down the hallway. I could hear its claws scraping against the walls, feel the floor shake with every step it took. There was only one place left to go, the basement. I threw open the door and stumbled down the stairs, my legs trembling. The creature was right behind me, its growls growing louder, more feral. I had to do something, anything, to stop it. In a panic, I ran to the small door at the far end of the basement, the one with no handle, the one that had haunted my dreams. Without thinking, I pressed my hand against the wood, and to my surprise, the door swung open. Inside was a small dark chamber, barely big enough for a person to stand in. I turned around, and there it was, the creature, standing at the foot of the stairs, its eyes gleaming in the dim light. There was no escape. The creature lunged, its claws outstretched, and I slammed the door shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. I don't know how long I've been in here. The scratching has stopped, but I can still hear it sometimes, the growls, the heavy footsteps moving through the house above me. I'm trapped. I realize now that there was never any escaping it. The creature, the beast, it was waiting for me, and now I'm part of its story, just like all the others.
Voices in the static. I've always had a thing for old electronics. Radios, turntables, recorders, something about the analog warmth, the weight of history embedded in each crackle and hiss of the sound waves. So when I stumbled upon the radio at a dusty thrift store on the outskirts of town, I couldn't resist. It was a relic from the 1950s, its wooden casing chipped and faded, but still intact. A few dials were missing, and the cloth grille over the speaker was torn in one corner, but that just added to its charm. I could imagine the lives it had lived, the rooms it had filled with news reports and music. But what really intrigued me was the sign next to it. Only works during storms. I laughed at the absurdity of it, thinking it was some kind of sales gimmick. Still, I was curious. For $20, it was a steal. I bought the radio, brought it back to my apartment, and set it on the small table by the window. My place wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit on the third floor of a run-down building, but it was mine, and now it had a new centerpiece. That first night the weather was calm, so I didn't expect anything from the radio. I plugged it in anyway, twisting the remaining dials, but all I got was static. It wasn't surprising. Something that old probably didn't even pick up modern frequencies. I left it alone and went about my evening, not thinking much more about it. But 2 nights later, everything changed. It was a late summer evening when the storm rolled in. The sky had been clear all day, but just after sundown, dark clouds gathered on the horizon, and the first rumbles of thunder echoed through the streets. I had always loved thunderstorms, the way the air smelled before the rain, the low hum of anticipation in the atmosphere. But that night, something was different. The static started around 9 p.m. I had just settled in with a beer, flipping channels on the TV, when the radio crackled to life. I hadn't touched it, hadn't even thought about it since I brought it home, but there it was, humming and buzzing like it had been waiting for the storm. At first, I thought maybe the rain was interfering with the electricity, but the lights were steady, the TV was fine. The radio, though, its static filled the room, drowning out everything else. I stood up, walked over and turned the volume knob, expecting to turn it off, but as soon as my fingers touched the dial, the static shifted. And then, a voice. It was faint at first, buried beneath layers of white noise. I leaned in closer, pressing my ear to the radio, adjusting the dials carefully. The voice grew clearer, though still distorted, like it was traveling through time itself. The body, found in the woods, dismembered. I froze, a chill running down my spine. The voice was male, gravelly, like someone who had been smoking for decades. There was a strange, hollow quality to it, like it wasn't really coming from the radio at all, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere darker. I turned the volume up. Police say no witnesses, a brutal murder, left for dead. My heart began to race. I glanced out the window. The rain was coming down hard now, slamming against the glass, but all I could hear was that voice. It was describing a murder that had happened recently, not some old news broadcast from the 1950s. My mind raced. Was this some kind of rogue broadcast? A pirate station reporting on crimes? But then the voice shifted again. Name was Susan Warner. She never saw it coming. My stomach turned. I knew that name. Susan Warner. She had been found dead in the woods a few miles outside of town just a week ago. It had been all over the local news. Gruesome, horrific. The kind of story that stuck with you, even if you didn't know her personally. But how was the radio talking about it now? I hadn't tuned it to any station. I hadn't even touched it when the storm began. And the way the voice described her murder, it was too detailed, too specific. I reached for the dial again, intending to shut it off, but as soon as my hand touched the radio, the voice grew louder. And the next one will be found. Soon. I yanked the plug from the socket, and the radio went silent. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, staring at the now lifeless machine. What the hell had just happened? I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just some weird interference, maybe a delayed signal from a news report I hadn't heard yet. I left the radio unplugged and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. My mind kept replaying that voice, the way it had described Susan's death like it had been there, watching, waiting. The next morning I checked the news, but there was nothing new, no updates on the murder, no other bodies found. I told myself I had imagined it, static and an overactive imagination fueled by the storm, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. A week passed, and the radio stayed quiet. I didn't dare plug it back in, not after that night. But the weather had been calm, and without the storm, it was just an old, useless box. I tried to push the whole thing out of my mind, convincing myself that it had been nothing more than a strange fluke. But then the second storm hit. This one came without warning, a sudden onslaught of wind and rain that rattled the windows and sent the lights flickering. I was sitting at my desk, working on an article, when the static started again. My blood went cold. The radio was still unplugged. I stared at it, my hands frozen above the keyboard as the static grew louder, filling the apartment with that same eerie buzz. Slowly I stood up, inching toward the radio. And then, just like before, the voice returned. And the next one, "She'll be found by the river, drowned." My mouth went dry. "Name is Rachel Connors, 34 years old. She won't survive the night." I grabbed the radio, yanking at the cord even though it wasn't plugged in. The voice didn't stop. "They'll find her body in the morning, washed up on the rocks." I threw the radio across the room, watching as it smashed into the wall and fell to the floor in pieces. But even as it lay there, broken, the static continued, faint but persistent, like a whisper crawling through the air. The next morning, I saw the news. Rachel Connors, 34 years old, had been found dead by the river, drowned, just like the voice had said. I couldn't believe it. How was this happening? How had the radio known? I hadn't touched it, hadn't even plugged it in, but somehow it had predicted, no, it had described her death in perfect detail, hours before it happened. I needed answers. I started researching the radio's manufacturer, digging through old forums and online archives, trying to find any connection between the model I had and something, anything, that could explain what was going on. But there was nothing. The company had gone out of business decades ago, and as far as I could tell, no one had ever reported anything strange about their products. I thought about getting rid of the radio, throwing it in the trash, maybe even smashing it to pieces. But something stopped me. A morbid curiosity, maybe, or a fear that whatever was happening would just follow me, no matter what I did. That night, the storm returned. The static started again, louder this time, more aggressive. I didn't even need to be near the radio to hear it. The voice came through, clear and menacing, cutting through the air like a blade. "He's next. His name is Michael Gray." I froze. He won't see it coming, but he'll feel it, every last second of it. My heart pounded in my chest as the realization hit me. The voice, it was talking about me. I was the next one, the next victim. There's no escape, not from me. I grabbed the radio, smashing it to the floor again and again, but the voice didn't stop. Not from what's coming. I ran out of the apartment, the storm raging around me, rain slashing at my face as I sprinted down the street. I didn't know where I was going, only that I needed to get away from the radio, from the voice, from whatever was happening. But no matter how far I ran, I could still hear it, the static, the voice. It was inside my head now. I stumbled into an alley, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The rain pounded against the pavement, pooling at my feet, but all I could hear was the voice, whispering, taunting, "There's no escape, Michael, no escape." I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was useless. The voice was everywhere, surrounding me, closing in. And then, through the static, I heard the final words. "They'll find your body right here, in this alley. I looked up, my heart hammering in my chest, and there, standing at the far end of the alley, was a figure, tall, shrouded in shadow, and holding something gleaming in the dim light of the street lamp. A knife. The last thing I heard, before everything went dark, was the voice, laughing. The next morning the rain had stopped, the storm had passed. In a small, quiet alley on the outskirts of town, the body of Michael Gray was found. The police never solved the case. They never could explain the radio they found, broken and shattered in his apartment, still humming with static. And somewhere in the distance, the voice continued.
The Weeping Woman. I didn't believe in ghost stories. I'd heard plenty growing up in the small rural town of Cedarbrook, where folklore was as much a part of the town's history as the buildings themselves. The older folks loved to tell tales of the Weeping Woman, the spectral figure who roamed the forest just beyond the town limits, luring people to their deaths. They said she was the ghost of a mother who had drowned her own children in the river during a fit of madness centuries ago. Now she wandered the woods, crying for her lost children, seeking out those marked for death. The legend was supposed to keep kids out of the forest at night, but I'd always dismissed it as just that, a legend. That is, until the night I saw her. It was late October and the air was starting to carry the chill of winter. I had just returned to Cedarbrook after living in the city for a few years. The pace of urban life had worn me down, and I'd come back to my childhood home for some peace and quiet. The town hadn't changed much in the time I'd been away. Same narrow streets, same old brick buildings, same dense forest that seemed to press in on the town like an ancient living thing. I had gone for a walk that evening, taking one of the old trails that wound through the woods. I'd been walking for about an hour when the light started to fade, casting long shadows between the trees. I should have turned back, but there was something about the stillness of the woods that made me want to keep going. It was peaceful, until it wasn't. That's when I saw her. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. Just beyond the clearing, near the edge of the trees, there was a figure, a woman, standing perfectly still, her back to me. She was dressed in an old-fashioned white gown that seemed to glow in the fading light. Her long, dark hair hung down her back, and I could see her shoulders shaking, as if she were crying. I stopped, my heart suddenly pounding. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaky in the stillness. She didn't respond. She didn't move. I took a step closer, and that's when I heard it. The soft, heart-wrenching sound of someone weeping. It echoed through the trees, rising and falling like the wind. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. Something about the sound. It didn't feel right. It felt wrong. Too sorrowful. Too desperate. Like it was coming from someplace deep and unnatural. I took another step, and that's when she turned. Her face, or rather, the lack of it. Her eyes were hollow, empty voids, her mouth open in a silent scream of eternal grief. Her skin was pale, waterlogged, as if she had just crawled from the depths of a lake. She didn't speak. She only stared at me with those hollow eyes, the sound of her weeping now ringing louder in my ears, as if it were coming from inside my own head. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and when I blinked, she was gone. I ran back to my house as fast as I could, not daring to look back. The forest, which had felt so peaceful just moments ago, now seemed to close in around me, dark and suffocating. My chest was tight, and my breath came in ragged gasps as I finally reached the front door and slammed it behind me. I tried to rationalize what I'd seen. Maybe it had been a trick of the light. Maybe I'd imagined it. But no matter how much I tried to convince myself, the sound of her weeping echoed in my mind, like a song I couldn't forget. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind outside, made me jump. But it wasn't until the early hours of the morning that I heard it again, the weeping. It started softly, like a distant echo, but then it grew louder. I sat up in bed, my heart pounding. The sound was coming from outside, from somewhere near the house. I crept to the window and pulled back the curtain just enough to peer outside. The forest loomed in the distance, dark and impenetrable, but closer, just beyond the edge of my backyard. I saw her again, the weeping woman. She was standing there, her back to me, her shoulders shaking as she cried into the night. And then, just like before, she vanished. The days that followed were worse. It wasn't just the weeping at night. Strange things started happening around the house. I would find wet footprints on the floor, leading from the front door to the living room, even though I hadn't gone outside. Sometimes I would wake up to the sound of water dripping, only to find small puddles of water pooling near the windows. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself that it was all in my head, but the signs kept getting worse. One night, I woke up to the feeling of cold hands brushing against my skin. I jolted awake, my breath catching in my throat, but there was no one there. Just the lingering chill, like someone had been standing over me while I slept. That's when I knew she had marked me. I remembered the stories from my childhood, the ones the older kids used to tell to scare us. The weeping woman didn't just appear to anyone. She only showed herself to those who were marked for death, those who would soon drown, just like her children. The weeping was a warning, and the wet footprints were a sign that her curse was coming for me. I couldn't stay in the house anymore. The weight of her presence was suffocating, the constant crying driving me to the brink of madness. I decided to go into town, to talk to someone, anyone, who might know more about the legend. I went to the local library, where I found Mrs. Grant, the town's oldest living resident and unofficial historian. She'd lived in Cedarbrook her entire life and knew more about the town's past than anyone. When I mentioned the weeping woman, her face went pale, and she quickly ushered me into a back room where we could speak in private. "You've seen her, haven't you?" she asked, her voice trembling. I nodded, unable to find the words. Mrs. Grant sighed, her shoulders sagging as if the weight of the world had settled on her. "It's not just a ghost story, you know. It's real. The weeping woman. Her name was Eleanor Mayhew. She lived here, back in the 1700s. She was a mother, had 3 children. But something went wrong." "What do you mean?" I asked, leaning in closer. "She was a troubled woman," Mrs. Grant continued. "Her husband died in a terrible accident, and she was left to care for the children on her own. But the grief, it drove her mad. One night, during a terrible storm, she took her children to the river and drowned them." I felt a lump form in my throat as Mrs. Grant spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Afterward, she threw herself into the river, but the townspeople found her body the next day, and they say her spirit never left. She's been wandering ever since, looking for her children. And when she can't find them, she takes others in their place." "Why me?" I asked, my voice shaking. "Why has she marked me?" Mrs. Grant hesitated. "There's something else. The weeping woman wasn't just a grieving mother. She was evil. Before she drowned her children, there were others. She killed people, dozens of them. She would lure them into the forest, drown them in the river. She was a serial killer, even before her death. Her madness didn't end with her children." My heart raced as I processed her words. The weeping woman wasn't just a ghost. She was a murderer, and I was her next victim. That night, the weeping was louder than ever, echoing through every room in the house. I tried to block it out, but it was impossible. It surrounded me, filling my mind, my soul, with her endless grief. The wet footprints were everywhere now, leading from room to room, and the windows were streaked with water, as if they had been splashed from the outside. I knew what I had to do. Mrs. Grant had told me that there was only one way to break the curse, to sacrifice someone else. The weeping woman needed a victim, and if I didn't give her one, I would be next. The thought made me sick to my stomach, but the fear was stronger than my revulsion. I had to survive. I thought of Dave, my neighbour. He had always been kind to me, always offering to help around the house. He was older, lived alone, no family nearby. No one would miss him, I rationalised. No one would notice if he disappeared. I couldn't believe what I was thinking. But the sound of the weeping, it was driving me mad. I decided that night would be the night. I would lure Dave into the woods, lead him to the river, and let the weeping woman take him instead. But when the time came, I couldn't do it. I couldn't bring myself to sacrifice an innocent man to save my own life. The guilt, the horror of what I was about to do, it was too much. I turned back, ready to accept my fate. And that's when I heard it, the rushing of water. The weeping grew louder, more frantic, and as I stood at the edge of the forest, I saw her again, the weeping woman. Her hollow eyes stared into mine, and for the first time, I saw the truth in them. She wasn't just a ghost. She was a force of pure malevolence, driven by centuries of rage and sorrow. The ground beneath me began to shake, and I felt a cold, wet hand grip my ankle. I screamed, stumbling backward as water rose up around me, pooling at my feet, even though there was no river in sight. The last thing I heard was the sound of rushing water, the cold hands dragging me down. In the morning, they found my body at the edge of the river, just like all the others. And in the distance, the weeping woman's cries echoed through the forest, searching for her next victim.
The Ferryman's Toll. The legend of the ferryman had always been whispered about in the quiet corners of our town. Parents used it to frighten their children into obedience, and old-timers recounted it over drinks at the local bar. They said the ferryman was a ghost, a creature that lived on the mist-covered banks of the river that snaked through the forest just outside of town. According to the stories, anyone who took the ferryman's boat across the river was never seen again. Those who did return, if they were lucky enough, came back broken, haunted by something they could never fully explain. I never put much stock in ghost stories. I'd always been a rational person, someone who needed hard facts and evidence to believe in anything. But the older I got, the more the legend began to gnaw at me. I'm not sure why. Maybe it was because so many of the people I'd grown up with treated it like it was real. Or maybe it was because of the nightmares. The first one came after I'd seen an old article in a local archive. I was doing research for a project on local folklore when I came across a grainy black and white photograph of the river, shrouded in fog. There was a figure, barely visible, standing on the riverbank, holding what looked like a long wooden pole. The caption beneath it read, "The last known sighting of the ferryman, 1923. That night, I dreamt of the river. It was always the same. I stood on the edge of the water, the dense fog pressing in on me, suffocating. The river stretched out before me, wide and black, its surface rippling like liquid obsidian. There was a boat, an old wooden vessel, drifting just a few feet away. And in the boat stood the ferryman, a tall, gaunt figure, draped in a cloak so dark it seemed to absorb the light around him. His face was hidden beneath a hood, and all I could see were his hands, thin, bony, and gripping a long wooden oar. In the dream, he never spoke. He only held out his hand, palm up, waiting. Each time, I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the image of the ferryman burned into my mind. But the worst part wasn't the dream itself, it was the feeling it left me with. A lingering sense of dread, like something was waiting for me just beyond the veil of reality. I tried to push the dreams aside, but they became more frequent. Every night, the same scene. The river, the boat, the ferryman. I would wake up gasping for air, feeling as though the fog had followed me from the dream and wrapped itself around my chest. And then, the real strange things started happening. It was small at first. Objects in my apartment began moving. Nothing drastic, just subtle shifts. I would set my keys down on the table, only to find them on the windowsill later. I'd leave a book on my nightstand, and when I returned, it would be on the floor. Pages open to passages about death and crossing into the afterlife. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, waiting. My once peaceful apartment now felt oppressive, like the air had grown thick and heavy. The ferryman's image was always there, lurking in the back of my mind, and I found myself thinking about the river constantly. There was only one way to stop it. I had to go to the river. I had to see if there was any truth to the legend. The night I went to the river, the fog was thicker than I had ever seen. It hung low over the water, so dense it felt like walking through a cloud. My breath came out in shallow puffs, the cold air biting at my skin. The world felt muted, like I had stepped into a different reality, a place where time didn't quite function as it should. I stood at the edge of the water, the same spot I had seen in my dreams. The river was wide, its black surface eerily still, reflecting nothing but the fog that hovered just above it. The silence was deafening. For a moment, I thought I had been foolish to come here. It was just an old story. But as I turned to leave, I saw it, the boat. It drifted out of the fog, just as it had in my dreams. An ancient wooden vessel, weathered and worn, but sturdy. And standing in the boat was the ferryman. My breath caught in my throat. He was exactly as I had seen him in the nightmares. Tall, gaunt, cloaked in darkness, his face obscured beneath a hood. His hand, skeletal and pale, gripped the oar, and the boat glided silently toward the shore. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I knew what he wanted. Without thinking, I stepped forward, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't want to get on the boat. Every fiber of my being screamed for me to turn and run, to leave this place and never look back. But my feet moved on their own, carrying me toward the riverbank. The ferryman held out his hand, palm up, just as he had in the dreams. I hesitated, and then slowly, I placed my hand in his. The cold was like nothing I had ever felt before. It seeped into my skin, freezing me to the bone. The ferryman pulled me into the boat, and as soon as my feet touched the wooden planks, I knew there was no going back. The boat drifted away from the shore, and the fog closed in around us, swallowing the world whole. For what felt like hours, the ferryman and I moved through the fog, the oar cutting through the water in slow, deliberate strokes. The silence was absolute, broken only by the soft lapping of water against the boat. I tried to speak, to ask him where we were going, but the words died in my throat. The air was thick with something heavy, something ancient. I could feel it pressing down on me, wrapping around my chest like invisible hands. I glanced over the side of the boat, peering into the dark water below. For a moment I thought I saw something, faces, pale and distorted, staring up at me from beneath the surface. Their eyes were wide with terror, their mouths open in silent screams. I jerked back, my heart racing. My mind was playing tricks on me, I told myself. It had to be. But as we drifted further, the hallucinations grew worse. The fog seemed to shift, taking on strange, unnatural shapes. I saw figures moving in the mist, shadowy silhouettes, distorted and twisted, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and wrong. Whispers filled the air, low and guttural, like voices from another world. I closed my eyes, willing the nightmare to end. But when I opened them again, the ferryman was standing directly in front of me, his hooded face inches from mine. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I still couldn't see his face, just the deep, impenetrable darkness beneath the hood. But I could feel his gaze, cold and unrelenting, boring into me. "You have crossed the river," he said, his voice low and hollow, like the echo of a long-forgotten memory. "But you have not paid the toll." I blinked, confused. "What toll?" The ferryman didn't answer. Instead, he reached out, his hand closing around my wrist in a grip that felt like iron. Panic surged through me. I tried to pull away, but his grip tightened, the cold seeping deeper into my skin. My vision blurred, the world spinning around me as a wave of nausea washed over me. "You must pay," the ferryman whispered, his voice echoing in my mind. "One soul for passage." I shook my head, struggling against him. "I don't have anything to give." The ferryman's grip tightened, and for the first time, I saw his face, pale and sunken, his eyes hollow, his lips twisted into a grotesque smile. His breath was cold against my skin as he leaned closer, Then you will take my place. The world spun, the fog swirling around me in a dizzying blur. My head throbbed, my chest tightening as the ferryman's words echoed in my mind. I felt his cold breath on my neck, his skeletal fingers digging into my skin. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was out. When I opened my eyes, I was alone in the boat. The ferryman was gone, the oar resting at my feet. I stood up, my legs trembling beneath me, and looked around. The fog was still there, thick and impenetrable, but the river, it was different, darker, colder. The water churned beneath the boat, and I could feel something moving below the surface. I reached for the oar, my hands shaking. I didn't know where I was, or how to get back, but I knew I had to keep moving. As I dipped the oar into the water, a cold realization washed over me. The ferryman hadn't just taken me across the river, he had taken my place. I looked down at my hands, thin, pale, skeletal. My heart pounded in my chest as I pulled the hood over my head, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The boat drifted forward, and in the distance, through the fog, I saw a figure standing on the shore, waiting. And so, the cycle continues. The ferryman's toll must be paid, and now, I am the one who collects it, forever.
The midnight caller. It all started with the phone. I'd just moved into a new apartment, a modest place in the middle of the city, the kind that was too expensive for its size but boasted a good view and a quiet neighborhood. I hadn't planned on moving so soon, but after the breakup and a particularly stressful few months at work, I needed a fresh start. The apartment had been advertised as recently renovated, which was mostly true. Fresh paint on the walls, new fixtures in the kitchen, and modern lighting in the hallway. But there was one thing that wasn't new: the phone. In the far corner of the living room, sitting on a small side table, was an old rotary phone. One of those clunky, beige-colored relics from the 1980s, the kind you'd expect to find in your grandparents' house. I hadn't noticed it when I toured the place, and now that I was moving in, it seemed like a strange artifact to leave behind. I tried to unplug it, thinking it was just some leftover junk from the previous tenant, but the cord was buried deep in the wall, and it didn't connect to any outlet I could find. Maybe it had been installed ages ago and just never taken out. The realtor hadn't mentioned it, and since I rarely used a landline anymore, I figured it wouldn't be an issue. Besides, it wasn't connected to any service, or so I thought. The first time it rang was about a week after I moved in. It was late, just after midnight, and I was half asleep on the couch, the TV droning on in the background. The sudden shrill ring cut through the quiet, making me jump. At first I didn't realize what it was. The sound was unfamiliar, jarring. It took me a few seconds to locate the source of the noise, the rotary phone in the corner. My first thought was that it had to be some kind of prank. The phone wasn't connected to any service, right? I hadn't given out this number to anyone, so why was it ringing? Curiosity got the better of me. I picked up the receiver. Hello? There was no response, just silence on the other end. I waited a moment, listening to the faint crackle of the line. Then the sound of heavy breathing, slow, deliberate. Someone was there. Someone was listening. Who is this? I asked, my voice shaky. The breathing continued for a few more seconds, and then the line went dead. I hung up, my heart racing, chalking it up to some random misdial or a technical glitch. But a gnawing feeling settled in the pit of my stomach. Something wasn't right. The calls continued the next night. Again, just after midnight, the phone rang. This time I was ready for it. I answered on the first ring. Who is this? I demanded, trying to sound more confident than I felt. Silence. Then the breathing. But this time, after a few seconds, a voice spoke, low, gravelly, and cold. I see you. A chill ran down my spine. I glanced around the room, my eyes darting to the windows, but the curtains were drawn, and the apartment was locked up tight. Who are you? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. No answer. just more breathing, followed by a soft click as the line went dead. I hung up, my hands trembling. Someone was playing a sick joke, and it was starting to get to me. I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, nothing that could explain where these calls were coming from. I decided to leave the phone off the hook for the rest of the night. The third night was when it started to get personal. Just after midnight, the phone rang again, even though I had left it off the hook. The noise was piercing, and it echoed through the apartment like a siren. I hesitated for a moment before answering, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello?" I said, my voice shaking. This time the voice spoke immediately. "You left the light on in the kitchen." I froze. My blood turned to ice. I had left the light on in the kitchen. I could see it glowing faintly from where I stood in the living room. But how did they know? No one else was in the apartment, and there were no windows overlooking the kitchen from the outside. "Who are you?" I demanded again, but the voice didn't answer. Instead, the breathing grew heavier, more labored, like whoever was on the other end was growing excited. Then, just as before, the line went dead. I hung up, my hands shaking. There was no way someone could have known about the light. I had locked all the doors, checked all the windows. No one was in here with me. But the voice, it was like they were watching me, like they could see every move I made. I couldn't sleep after that. The phone calls had wormed their way into my mind, and I found myself constantly looking over my shoulder, listening for sounds that weren't there. My once cozy apartment now felt like a cage, and the phone was the key that kept me trapped. I spent the next day trying to figure out what was going on. I called the phone company, but they had no record of the old rotary phone being connected to any active service. It was a deadline, as far as they were concerned. Dead. That word stuck with me. Later that afternoon, I went to the local library, hoping to dig up some information about the building. Maybe there had been other tenants before me who'd experienced something similar. It was a long shot, but I was desperate. After a few hours of searching through old newspaper archives, I found something. In 1985, there had been a series of murders in the city, all connected to a man named Harold Vance. He had been a notorious serial killer, infamous for terrorizing his victims with phone calls before brutally murdering them. He would call them late at night, describe their every move, and then break into their homes to finish what he had started. Harold Vance was executed in 1987, but the apartment I had moved into, it had been one of the locations where he had made his calls. The victims had lived here, and the phone, the same phone that now sat in my living room, had been his tool of terror. My stomach churned as I read the details of his crimes, the calls, the stalking, the brutal killings. Vance had enjoyed watching his victims squirm, loved the fear that crept into their voices when they realized he was close. And now, decades after his death, I was hearing his voice. That night, the phone rang again, midnight on the dot. I didn't want to answer it, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. My hands were clammy as I picked up the receiver, and the voice greeted me before I could even say hello. "You can't escape me." My heart pounded in my chest. "I'm closer than you think," the voice rasped. "You left the bedroom door open." I glanced toward the hallway. The bedroom door was open. I could see the dark interior of the room, the shadows playing tricks on my mind. I hadn't been in there since earlier in the day. How could he know? I slammed the phone down, my breath coming in short, sharp gasps. But it wasn't over. The phone rang again and again. Each time I ignored it, but the ringing grew louder, more insistent, until it felt like the walls were vibrating with the sound. Finally, I grabbed the phone, yanking it from the wall, the cord ripping free with a violent snap. The ringing stopped, and for a moment, there was silence. But then my cell phone rang. I stared at it, dread pooling in my stomach. The number was blocked. My hand shook as I answered it. Hello? The voice on the other end was Harold Vance. You can't stop me, he whispered. I'm always watching, always. I dropped the phone, backing away, but it didn't stop. The landline, the cell phone, even my laptop began to buzz with incoming calls, each one a haunting reminder that Vance was there. The calls weren't just coming from one phone anymore, they were everywhere. And then, in the suffocating silence between the rings, I heard it. Footsteps, coming from the hallway. I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest, and saw the dark outline of a figure standing in the doorway to my bedroom. The phone in my hand rang one last time. In the end, I was found sitting in the corner of my apartment, my hands gripping the old rotary phone, the receiver pressed to my ear. They said I was muttering something under my breath, something about not being able to stop the calls. But the phone wasn't connected. It hadn't been connected in decades. And Harold Vance, he was still calling.
The glass cage. I never should have agreed to join the dig. Not that I had much choice. It was my career, after all. When the opportunity to be part of the archaeological team unearthing an ancient tomb in the remote desert presented itself, I jumped at it like any other young, eager archaeologist would. This was the stuff of legend, an untouched burial site, rumored to be over 2,000 years old, hidden beneath the scorching sands, forgotten by time. It was exactly the kind of discovery that could make a name for someone like me, but no one had warned me about the curse. We arrived at the site, a desolate expanse of sun-baked earth stretching for miles in every direction. The heat was oppressive, relentless. Even though we had set up camp near the dig, the isolation weighed heavily on all of us. There were 5 in our team: Dr. Marcus, the head of the expedition, a seasoned archaeologist with a penchant for danger; Carla, an experienced researcher; Samir, the local guide who knew the desert's secrets; Raoul, an expert in ancient languages; and me, Tom Harker, eager but naive, more focused on the glory of discovery than the potential dangers lurking in forgotten tombs. The locals had whispered about the site. Samir had tried to warn us. He said that the tomb was cursed, that it was forbidden to disturb what lay beneath the sand. According to him, centuries ago, a man named Ra-Akur had been buried alive in the tomb after committing unspeakable acts. A murderer, a sadist, a serial killer long before the term existed. His legend was as dark as the desert nights. Ra-Akur had tortured and killed dozens, relishing in the fear and pain he inflicted. His name had been stricken from every record, every monument, erased from history as a final punishment. But they didn't just kill him. They entombed him alive, locking him in a glass coffin so he could see the world from his eternal prison, yet never escape. Of course, we dismissed the warnings as superstition. Dr. Marcus was particularly scornful of the idea. "A glass coffin, really? Ridiculous," he had said with a sneer. But Samir's words stuck with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. It took us several weeks of excavation to finally unearth the entrance to the tomb. Hidden beneath layers of stone and sand, the entrance was marked by faded inscriptions, warning intruders to turn back. Raoul, who was fluent in several ancient languages, deciphered the text, his voice hesitant as he read aloud. "Here lies Ra-Akur, the harbinger of death, sealed for eternity, his hunger for blood quenched by the glass cage. Disturb not his sleep, lest his wrath be unleashed once more." A shiver ran down my spine as he spoke the words, but Marcus, ever the skeptic, waved it off as ancient propaganda. "Come on, people," he said, gripping his pickaxe. "This tomb's been buried for millennia. There's no serial killer locked inside, just a bunch of artifacts waiting to be uncovered." I wasn't so sure. Still, I didn't object as we pried open the stone doors and descended into the tomb. The interior of the tomb was astonishing. Elaborate carvings lined the walls, depicting scenes of life and death, presided over by a figure that could only be Ra-Akur. His likeness appeared again and again, towering over victims, his hands raised as if conducting some gruesome ritual. As we moved deeper, the air grew colder, and the sense of unease became almost palpable. And then we found it. The glass coffin. It was pristine, impossibly so. No cracks, no signs of wear or age. The coffin was made of a translucent material, glass or something like it, resting atop a stone platform. Inside was a figure, perfectly preserved, as though time had never touched him. Ra-Akur. His eyes were closed, his skin taut over his bones, and his hands rested on his chest, clutching what looked like an ancient dagger. For a long moment, none of us spoke. The only sound was the soft hum of the desert wind outside, filtering down into the tomb like a distant whisper. Dr. Marcus was the first to break the silence. This is incredible," he muttered, eyes wide. "Do you know what this means? This kind of preservation is unheard of." I felt a knot of dread tightening in my stomach. The inscriptions had warned us, but Marcus, as always, was too focused on his ambition to care. "We need to open it," Marcus said, already moving toward the coffin. "We need to see what's inside." Carla hesitated. "Are you sure? The seal. It hasn't been broken for thousands of years. Maybe we should—" "Don't be ridiculous," Marcus snapped. "This is the find of the century. We're opening it." The moment the seal was broken, everything changed. The air in the tomb shifted, growing colder, almost unbearably so. A low, almost imperceptible rumble echoed through the chamber, and the lights from our equipment flickered. The glass coffin hissed as the lid lifted, and for a brief moment I thought I saw the figure inside twitch. I must have imagined it. Marcus peered inside, grinning like a madman. "Look at him," he said. "It's like he's been frozen in time. This is beyond anything we've ever seen." But as he reached toward the figure, the lights went out. For a few seconds, there was nothing but darkness and the sound of our panicked breathing. Then the lights flickered back on, dim and unstable. Ra-Akur was gone. The coffin was empty. The body, the dagger, everything had vanished. I stared at the glass coffin, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be real. Bodies didn't just disappear. I blinked, trying to make sense of what had happened, but no matter how much I tried, I couldn't explain it. Marcus was furious. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, pacing around the coffin. "This isn't possible!" But it had happened, and that was just the beginning. The first death happened 2 nights later. We had returned to camp, shaken, but trying to convince ourselves that maybe we had missed something. Maybe the body had disintegrated, or maybe there had been a hidden compartment we hadn't seen. But deep down we all knew something was wrong. It was Raoul who died first. We found him outside his tent, his body twisted at an unnatural angle, his face frozen in a mask of terror. His throat had been slit, and ancient symbols had been carved into his skin, symbols that matched the ones we had seen in the tomb. Carla screamed when she saw him. Marcus tried to rationalize it, saying it had to be some kind of animal attack, but there was no way an animal could have done that. No human could have done that. The rest of us knew it was Ra-Akur. He was free. After Raoul's death, everything spiraled out of control. Samir vanished the next day, his tent left untouched, his belongings still inside, but his footprints led out into the desert toward the tomb. When we followed them, we found only a trail of blood leading into the darkness of the tomb's entrance. Carla was next. I heard her screams in the middle of the night, a desperate, blood-curdling sound that echoed through the camp. When Marcus and I reached her tent, it was already too late. She had been impaled, her body left hanging from one of the support beams. Her eyes were wide open, staring blankly ahead, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. Marcus and I were the only ones left. I knew it was Ray-Akur. The tomb we had opened had unleashed him, and now he was hunting us, one by one, using the ancient methods he had perfected thousands of years ago. The killings weren't just murders, they were rituals, sacrifices to some dark, forgotten god. By the 5th day, Marcus was losing his mind. He paced around camp, muttering to himself, clutching the ancient dagger we had found in the coffin. He blamed himself for everything, for ignoring the warnings, for opening the tomb, but it was too late. Ra-Akur was coming for us, and nothing could stop him. The visions started after that. Horrific glimpses of Ra-Akur's past, of the things he had done. I saw him in my dreams, standing over his victims, carving their flesh, draining their blood. Each night, the visions grew more vivid, more terrifying, until I could barely tell where the dreams ended and reality began. And then, Marcus disappeared. I woke one morning to find his tent empty, the dagger gone. I searched for him, calling his name, but I already knew where he had gone, back to the tomb. I found him standing in the center of the tomb, his back to me, the dagger in his hand. The glass coffin stood open before him, waiting. "Marcus," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "What are you doing?" He turned slowly, his eyes wide and unfocused. "It's the only way," he said, his voice trembling. "The only way to stop him." "What are you talking about?" "He needs a new body," Marcus said, his voice cracking. "A new vessel. That's what he's been after all along." I felt a cold wave of dread wash over me. "No." Before I could react, Marcus turned the dagger on himself, plunging it deep into his chest. Blood spilled from the wound, pooling on the floor of the tomb, and Marcus collapsed beside the coffin. And then the coffin began to close. I tried to run, but the tomb was like a maze, the walls shifting, closing in around me. The last thing I remember was the sound of the coffin sealing shut, and the overwhelming feeling of cold hands wrapping around my throat. When they find this journal, they will say that I went mad, that the desert drove me to hallucinations. But the truth is far worse than madness. I am still here. Ra-Akur has taken my body, but my soul is trapped. I can see everything, feel everything, but I am no longer in control. My body is now his vessel, and I can hear the whispers of the ancient god he serves, calling for more blood. And so, I wait. I wait for the next team to come, for the next archaeologists to dig too deep, to open what should have remained sealed. The glass coffin will wait for them, just as it waited for me, and Ra-Akur will rise again.
The Marionette Master. It was the opportunity of a lifetime. When I received the offer to join the legendary Belford Theatre troupe, I didn't think twice. I'd been trying to make it as an actor for years. Endless auditions, part-time gigs, anything to keep my dream alive. And then, out of the blue, this offer landed in my lap. A chance to perform at one of the most famous, if not infamous, theaters in the country. The Belford Theatre had a dark history, of course. Everyone knew the stories. The founder, Anton Varelli, had been a renowned puppeteer and director. His shows were known for their unsettling beauty, performances that blurred the line between reality and illusion, where the actors moved like marionettes, their performances so lifelike that some claimed they were more puppet than human. Varelli's obsession with control was legendary, and his downfall even more so. Decades ago, several actors disappeared from the troupe, their bodies never found. The theater closed soon after, and Varelli vanished without a trace, taking with him his secrets and his final act. The theater eventually reopened under new management, though it still carried an air of eerie mystery, as if the ghosts of Varelli's twisted productions still lingered in the rafters. When I first stepped into the theater, I felt a shiver run down my spine. It was beautiful in a haunting way, its grand stage framed by heavy velvet curtains, the seats stretching out into the darkness. The walls were adorned with old posters from Varelli's productions, their colors faded, but their unsettling imagery still striking. Grotesque puppets dancing on invisible strings, eyes wide and lifeless. The troupe welcomed me warmly, but even from the start, I could feel the weight of the place. The other actors seemed on edge, though they laughed it off when I asked about it. "The place has history, that's all," one of them said, waving away my concerns. "Once you get used to it, you'll love it here." I smiled, but I wasn't so sure. The rehearsals began soon after. Our director, a stern but passionate woman named Lillian, had big plans for the revival of Varelli's most famous play, The Marionette's Waltz. It was the show that had made Varelli a legend, and the one that had ended in bloodshed. The set was elaborate, filled with secret doors and trapdoors, with ropes and pulleys rigged to mimic the movements of marionettes. It was disorienting at first. There were moments when I felt like the stage itself was alive, shifting beneath me, as though it had a will of its own. But what unnerved me most were the marionettes. They were everywhere, hanging from the ceiling, arranged in the corners of the stage, their lifelike eyes following our every move. Some were human-sized, others smaller, but all of them had an eerie, almost grotesque quality to them. Their faces were frozen in expressions of fear or ecstasy, their limbs limp but poised, as if waiting for their next performance. I tried to ignore them, focusing on my lines and the blocking, but I could feel them watching me, and sometimes, just sometimes, I could have sworn they moved. The first incident happened during a late-night rehearsal. We were practicing a particularly difficult scene, one that required precise timing with the ropes and pulleys. I was on stage reciting my lines when one of the marionettes hanging overhead suddenly dropped. It plummeted to the stage with a sickening thud, its glassy eyes staring up at me as it lay crumpled at my feet. The other actors gasped, and I stepped back, my heart pounding. "Probably just a loose rope," Lillian said, though her face was pale. "It's an old rig, nothing to worry about." But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't an accident. The marionette had fallen too perfectly, landing exactly where I had been standing a moment before. That night, as I left the theater, I glanced back at the stage. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing in the shadows. Tall, with long, thin limbs, and a face obscured by darkness. But when I blinked, it was gone. As the days went on, things only got stranger. I started having nightmares. In my dreams, I was on stage, but I wasn't myself. I was a puppet, my limbs stiff and unnatural, jerking with every movement. I couldn't speak, couldn't scream. I could only watch as my body moved without my control, guided by invisible strings that pulled me in every direction. And there, in the wings, I could see him, Anton Varelli. His face was gaunt, his eyes wide and gleaming with madness. He smiled, and I woke up in a cold sweat. The feeling of being watched became constant. The marionettes, once just creepy props, now seemed to be everywhere I went. Their eyes followed me, their limbs shifting ever so slightly when no one was looking. I tried to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the stress of the play was getting to me, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. Then the accidents began. First, it was Olivia, one of the lead actresses. We were rehearsing a scene where she was supposed to be lowered from the rafters, suspended by ropes as if she were a marionette. But something went wrong. The ropes snapped, and she fell, plummeting to the stage floor. She survived, but barely. Her leg was shattered, and she was rushed to the hospital. After that, Raoul, one of the supporting actors, quit without warning. He didn't even show up for his final rehearsal, just left a note in his dressing room saying he couldn't be a part of the production anymore. No one could reach him, and his phone was disconnected. The rest of the troupe grew more anxious with each passing day. The accidents weren't just bad luck. There was something malevolent in the theater, something none of us wanted to admit. And then, one night, I found something that made my blood run cold. It was after another late rehearsal. I had stayed behind to run some lines on my own, hoping the empty theater would give me some peace of mind. But as I walked backstage, I noticed a small door I hadn't seen before. It was hidden behind one of the old set pieces, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. Curiosity got the better of me, and I opened the door. Behind it was a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. I hesitated for a moment, then grabbed a flashlight from one of the prop boxes and made my way down. The stairs led to a small, hidden room beneath the stage, and in that room, I found them, the marionettes, dozens of them, hanging from the ceiling, their strings tangled and twisted. But these weren't just any marionettes. Their faces, they were the faces of the missing actors, Olivia, Raoul, and even actors from the troupe who had vanished years ago. Their faces were perfectly replicated in wood and paint, but their eyes were real. I stumbled back, my heart racing, as the truth hit me like a hammer. Varelli hadn't just killed his victims, he had turned them into his marionettes, using their bodies in his twisted performances, and now he was doing it again. I had to get out. I had to warn the others. But as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me and the marionettes began to move. I ran back up the stairs, my breath coming in ragged gasps, but the theater seemed to shift around me, the corridors twisting and closing in. The shadows grew longer, and I could hear the faint sound of laughter, Varelli's laughter, echoing through the halls. When I finally made it back to the stage, the other actors were gone. The theater was empty, save for the marionettes, hanging from the rafters, their eyes fixed on me. And then, I saw him. Varelli stood in the center of the stage, just as I had seen him in my dreams. His face was gaunt and hollow, his hands thin and bony, as they held the strings of the marionettes. He smiled, and with a flick of his wrist, the marionettes came to life, dancing across the stage in grotesque, unnatural movements. "You're part of the show now," Varelli said, his voice low and cold, "just like the others." I tried to run, but I couldn't move. My limbs felt heavy, as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. I looked down, and to my horror, I saw the thin, glimmering threads attached to my wrists and ankles. Varelli laughed, his eyes gleaming with madness, as he pulled the strings tighter, forcing me to move, to dance. My body jerked and twisted, my muscles straining against the unnatural force controlling me. I could feel the strings cutting into my skin, deeper and deeper, as Varelli guided me through his twisted performance. I screamed, but no sound came out. Now, I am trapped. I can feel the strings pulling at my limbs, guiding my every movement, but I am no longer in control. My body is a puppet, a marionette in Varelli's final act, and I will perform for him forever. The others will come soon. New actors, eager to make their mark on the stage. They will see the marionettes, admire the craftsmanship, never knowing that beneath the wood and paint are the souls of the damned. And Varelli will be there, pulling the strings, waiting for his next victims.
The eternal flame. The town of Black Hollow wasn't on any map. I had never heard of it until a chance conversation with an old woman at a rest stop along the highway. I was taking a break from my job, a much-needed hiatus to travel across the country, when the woman mentioned the town's festival. "They have this bonfire," she said, her voice low and conspiratorial. "It's been burning for centuries, they say. It never goes out, not even in the rain. The flames are eternal." Curiosity piqued. I asked for more details, but the woman's smile turned sharp. "You'll have to see for yourself, dear. The Eternal Flame Festival starts in a week." She gave me vague directions before disappearing into the crowd. The encounter left a strange feeling in my gut, but I was intrigued. As someone who had always loved folklore and odd history, I couldn't resist the lure of an ancient fire that had supposedly been burning for centuries. The drive to Black Hollow was long and winding, the road narrowing as it cut through dense forests. I passed no other cars, and after a while, it began to feel like I was driving into another world. When I finally arrived, Black Hollow was as quaint and isolated as I had imagined. The streets were cobbled, the houses old but well kept, and there was an eerie stillness that hung in the air. The townspeople were friendly enough when I asked about the festival, but they had a peculiar intensity in their eyes whenever the eternal flame was mentioned. "The fire has kept our town alive," one of them said, their voice reverent. "It's why we're still here, after all this time." I didn't press further, though my curiosity grew with every passing day. The town had no internet, no cell service, and the world outside felt impossibly far away. I had no way of contacting anyone, and that sense of isolation only deepened as the festival approached. The festival itself was something out of time. No carnival rides, no food stalls, no neon lights. Instead, it was deeply rooted in tradition. The town square was adorned with old banners, their colours faded by time, and in the centre stood a massive stone hearth. The eternal flame burned at its core, a column of fire that roared and flickered, seemingly unaffected by the wind or the steady drizzle that had begun earlier in the evening. It was captivating, the kind of fire that draws you in with its warmth, its energy, and something more. The flames danced with an almost hypnotic rhythm, casting long shadows across the faces of the gathered townspeople. I watched as they circled the fire, their faces reflecting reverence, awe, and something darker, something like fear. I approached a woman standing nearby, hoping to learn more about the flame. Her name was Edith, and she had the appearance of someone who had lived in Black Hollow her entire life. She smiled at me, but there was something unsettling in her gaze. "They say the flame is eternal," Edith said. "Started burning centuries ago, when our ancestors sacrificed themselves to save the town." "Sacrificed?" I asked, my stomach twisting. Edith nodded. The winter was harsh, food was scarce, the townspeople were starving, freezing, so they made a deal with the flame. They offered themselves to it, and in return the fire has kept us warm ever since. I looked back at the fire, my unease growing. "You mean people actually burned themselves?" "Oh yes," she said, her voice soft. "The fire needs to be fed. It always has." That night I couldn't sleep. The stories of sacrifice and the intensity of the festival weighed heavily on my mind. The bed in my small inn-room felt foreign, and every creak of the old building made me startle awake. Around midnight, I heard the faint crackle of flames, followed by the scent of smoke, strong, acrid, as if something was burning nearby. I bolted upright, heart racing, but the room was dark, and there was no sign of fire. I checked the windows and doors, even ventured out into the hallway, but everything was quiet. Still, the smell of smoke lingered, clinging to my skin, filling my lungs. I returned to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Over the next few days, strange things started happening. I'd see flashes of fire out of the corner of my eye, small flickers that vanished the moment I turned to look. My dreams were plagued by visions of flames licking at my skin, the unbearable heat of them scorching me alive, while shadows danced in the periphery of my vision, whispering my name. Worse still, I began noticing odd behavior among the townspeople. Conversations would stop abruptly when I approached. They'd glance at each other as though sharing a secret, their eyes flicking toward the eternal flame as though they knew something I didn't. Even Edith, who had been so friendly, seemed more distant, her smile growing tighter each time we crossed paths. Then, one evening, I overheard something that chilled me to the bone. I was walking past the town's meeting hall when I heard voices inside, low, hurried whispers that I wasn't meant to hear. "She doesn't know," one voice said. "She will, soon enough," came another. "She's been chosen," the first voice continued, this time with an unmistakable tone of finality. "She'll keep the flame alive." I stumbled back, heart pounding, realizing with a sickening dread that they were talking about me. I had been chosen. I didn't know what to do. I couldn't leave. There was no way out. The roads that led to the town were cut off, as if Black Hollow had been swallowed by the forest. The locals assured me that the roads had been washed out by the rains, but something told me they were lying. I was trapped here, surrounded by people who wanted me to stay, people who needed me to stay. That night, the hallucinations got worse. The smell of smoke was everywhere, so thick I could barely breathe. The temperature in my room skyrocketed, as though the very walls were burning, and when I looked into the mirror, I saw myself wreathed in flames. The fire wasn't just in the hearth anymore. It was following me. I tried to escape. I packed my things and ran to the edge of town, but the fire was always there, waiting, The moment I neared the forest, the ground beneath me trembled, and I saw flames flickering in the trees, closing off every path. There was no escape. The fire was part of the town, part of the people, and now it was part of me. The day of the final festival ceremony arrived, and I knew, deep down, that I wasn't just a guest anymore. I was the sacrifice. The entire town gathered around the eternal flame, their faces lit by its glow. The air was thick with anticipation, and as I stood among them, I felt the weight of their gaze pressing down on me. They knew what was coming. They had planned this from the moment I arrived. Edith approached me, her eyes gleaming with something dark and ancient. "You understand now, don't you?" she whispered. "The flame needs you." I tried to back away, but the crowd closed in around me, their expressions no longer warm and welcoming. There was no fear in their eyes now, only hunger. The hunger of a town that had made a pact centuries ago, a pact that demanded blood. I turned toward the flame, and in that moment, I saw it for what it truly was. The fire was alive. It writhed and twisted, as though reaching out for me, its flames flickering like hands, beckoning me closer. I felt its heat on my skin, but more than that, I felt its pull, deep inside me, drawing me toward it. The whispers grew louder, the voices of the dead, those who had come before me, those who had been consumed by the flame. They were calling my name. I fought against it, tried to resist, but the fire was inside me now. It had been from the moment I set foot in Black Hollow. The hallucinations, the smoke, the heat, it had all been leading to this. The crowd parted, and Edith gestured toward the flame. "Step forward," she said, her voice calm, almost soothing. "It's your time." I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't obey. It was as if invisible hands were pushing me forward, guiding me toward the flames. My feet moved on their own, each step bringing me closer to the roaring fire. I could feel its heat intensifying, the flames licking at my skin. I was sweating, my heart pounding in my chest, but no one else moved to stop me. They stood silently, watching as I approached the flame. And then, as the fire reached for me, I realized the terrible truth. The fire didn't burn, not in the way you would expect. It didn't consume flesh, it consumed souls. It took those who were offered to it, and in return, it gave life to the town. I had been chosen to feed the flame, to become part of it, just like those who had come before me. The last thing I remember is stepping into the fire. It didn't hurt, not at first. The flames wrapped around me, pulling me into their embrace, and for a moment, I felt weightless. But then the pain came, slow, creeping, like being eaten from the inside out. I tried to scream, but the flames swallowed my voice, pulling me deeper into the inferno. The townspeople watched in silence as the fire consumed me, their faces lit by the glow of the eternal flame. And then, I was gone. The festival continues year after year. The flame still burns in the heart of Black Hollow, eternal and unyielding, fueled by those who are chosen. And somewhere deep inside the fire, I am still there, waiting.
The silent ones. The apartment complex was perfect, almost too perfect. When I first stumbled upon the listing online, it felt like fate. I had been searching for a new place after my last apartment fell victim to a noisy neighbor who seemed to think every night was party night. This one, however, was the opposite, advertised as a quiet, serene escape from the chaos of city life. It wasn't far from my office. The rent was surprisingly affordable, and the pictures made it look like something out of a brochure, clean, modern, with lush greenery surrounding the building. But what really drew me in were the reviews. Everyone who lived there praised its tranquility, the silence that enveloped the entire complex like a warm blanket. No noise complaints, no loud neighbors, nothing. It was exactly what I needed. When I arrived for the tour, the apartment manager, Mrs. Graham, greeted me at the door. She was an older woman, thin and elegant, with a soft, almost maternal smile. She moved with an unnatural grace, barely making a sound as she walked. Her voice was quiet too, so quiet I had to lean in to catch her words. "We value peace and quiet here, Mr. Daniels," she said, guiding me through the building's pristine hallways. "It's part of our way of life. Everyone here understands the importance of silence." I smiled, feeling instantly at ease. This was it, I thought. The peace I had been craving for months. I signed the lease on the spot. The first few days in the apartment were everything I had hoped for. The place was bright and spacious. The neighbors were polite, always offering a smile and a nod when I passed them in the hall. And most importantly, it was silent, utterly silent. I didn't hear footsteps in the hallway, no muffled conversations from the apartments next door. Even the usual creaks and groans of an old building were absent. It was as though the walls absorbed every sound, leaving nothing but a comfortable, calming stillness. But after the first week, the silence began to feel less like a luxury and more like a presence. It was everywhere, thick and suffocating. Even when I turned on the TV or played music, the sound felt muted, like the silence was pressing in from all sides, trying to drown out any noise. The neighbors, too, began to seem strange. I couldn't quite put my finger on it at first. They were friendly enough, always smiling, always polite, but there was something off about the way they moved, the way they never spoke. I hadn't realized it at first, but after a few days it hit me. I had never heard anyone talk. Not a word, not a laugh, not even a cough or a sneeze. The complex was eerily quiet, even when I saw people milling about in the common areas. One evening, as I was taking the trash out, I saw a group of residents gathered in the courtyard. They were standing in a circle, their hands moving in a series of quick, fluid motions. At first, I thought they were just gesturing, but then I realized they were signing, communicating entirely through sign language. I felt a sudden unease settle in my stomach. Was everyone here mute? That night, as I lay in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The silence, once a blessing, now felt oppressive, like the walls were closing in. I tossed and turned, trying to push the thoughts away, but the unease only grew stronger. And then I heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible, like the sound of wind slipping through a crack in the window. I sat up in bed, straining to hear. The whisper came again, this time a little louder, followed by the soft sound of footsteps. My heart began to race. I got out of bed and padded toward the door, my breath catching in my throat. The footsteps were coming from the hallway outside my apartment. I pressed my ear to the door, listening. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving only the heavy silence in its wake. I waited a few moments before cautiously opening the door and peeking out. The hallway was empty, bathed in the dim glow of the overhead lights. I stepped out, my bare feet making no sound on the cool floor, and glanced both ways down the corridor. No one. I shook my head, convincing myself that I had imagined it, just the paranoia of living in a place this quiet. But as I turned to head back inside, I saw something that stopped me cold. There, in the far corner of the hallway, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. They were standing perfectly still, facing the wall, their back to me. I couldn't see their face, but something about their posture, the unnatural stillness of it, sent a chill down my spine. I opened my mouth to say something, to ask if they were okay, but no sound came out. My throat felt tight, as though the very air around me had thickened. And then, just as suddenly as I had seen them, the figure stepped back into the shadows and disappeared. The next morning I woke with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. The figure in the hallway haunted me, and though I tried to tell myself it was just a trick of the light, I couldn't get it out of my head. I decided to ask Mrs. Graham about it. She'd been so welcoming when I moved in, and I figured she would know if someone had been wandering around late at night. When I knocked on her door, it took a few moments for her to answer. When she did, her smile was as warm as ever, though something about it seemed forced. "Good morning, Mr. Daniels," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Morning, Mrs. Graham. I just wanted to ask. Last night I thought I heard someone in the hallway, and I saw someone standing in the shadows. Do you know anything about that?" Her smile faltered slightly, just for a moment, before she regained her composure. "You must have been dreaming. No one is out late at night here. We value our peace and quiet." She gave me that same polite smile, the one that never reached her eyes, and closed the door before I could ask anything else. That night, the whispers returned, louder this time, like they were right outside my door. I lay in bed, frozen, my ears straining to pick up the sounds. The footsteps followed, soft but deliberate, pacing up and down the hallway. I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know what was happening. I grabbed a flashlight from my nightstand and crept toward the door, heart hammering in my chest. I flung the door open, the beam of light cutting through the darkness. The hallway was empty, but just as I was about to step back inside, I heard it again, the faintest sound, like the rustling of fabric. I turned the flashlight toward the end of the hall, and my blood ran cold. There they were, a group of residents standing in the darkness, silent, unmoving. Their eyes were fixed on me, their faces devoid of emotion. I could see their hands moving, signing something to each other, quick and precise. And then they began to walk toward me. I backed up, my breath coming in ragged gasps, and slammed the door shut. The whispers outside grew louder, more frantic, and I could hear the soft patter of feet approaching my door. I locked it, my hands shaking, and backed away. For the next hour, I sat in the dark, waiting for them to leave. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I packed a bag, determined to leave. But when I reached the front door of the apartment building, I found it locked. Not just locked, chained from the inside. There was no way out. I tried calling for help, but my phone had no signal. The landline in the lobby was dead, and the elevator refused to work. I was trapped. That's when Mrs. Graham appeared, her smile still fixed in place, though now there was something cold in her eyes. "You can't leave, Mr. Daniels," she said softly. "You've been chosen." "Chosen?" I asked, backing away. "What are you talking about?" She stepped closer, her hands moving in slow, deliberate signs. I didn't understand the gestures, but the message was clear. "We are the silent ones," she said, her voice barely more than a breath. "We live in peace, in quiet, and to maintain that peace, a sacrifice must be made." My heart pounded in my chest as the other residents appeared behind her, their faces expressionless, their hands signing rapidly to one another. "You've been chosen to keep the silence." They came for me that night. The whispers outside my door were deafening now, a constant murmur that grew louder with every passing moment. I tried to barricade the door, but it was no use. They were coming, and there was nothing I could do to stop them. The door creaked open, and they entered, moving silently into the room. Their hands moved in a flurry of signs, communicating with one another, though I couldn't understand the words. Mrs. Graham stood at the front of the group, her eyes gleaming in the dim light. "You will join us," she whispered. "Your voice will be taken, and you will know the peace of silence." I tried to scream, to shout, to beg for my life, but no sound came out. My voice was gone, swallowed by the oppressive quiet that filled the room. I could feel the weight of their gaze, the cold grip of their hands as they reached for me, pulling me into their silent world. Now, I am one of them. The silence is eternal, and I move through the hallways without a sound. I can't speak. I can't scream. I can only watch as they prepare for the next newcomer, the next sacrifice. The silent ones will continue, and I will be part of them forever.
The Collector of Hearts. I'd been a journalist for 10 years, long enough to see the worst humanity had to offer. But nothing, not the crime scenes, the corruption, or even the unspeakable violence I'd reported on, could have prepared me for this. The Collector. A name whispered in darkened corners, passed along by terrified residents who lived in the underbelly of the city, where the air stank of fear and decay. The first time I heard it, I didn't believe it. How could I? The story sounded like urban legend, too monstrous, too methodical to be real. But it was real. Too real. The Collector was a serial killer, unlike any I'd ever heard of. For over 3 decades, bodies had turned up across the city, their chests opened and their hearts missing. But it wasn't just the brutality of the murders that made the killings notorious. It was the artistry. Each victim had been posed, arranged like they were part of some grotesque exhibit, their bodies left in public places where they couldn't be ignored. Some called it a signature, but I knew better. It wasn't just a calling card. It was a statement. I had been drawn to the story from the moment I first heard about the Collector, driven by the same morbid curiosity that had gotten me into journalism in the first place. There was something terrifyingly compelling about the case, something I couldn't quite shake. And now, after months of investigation, I was closer to the truth than anyone had ever been. Too close, perhaps, because now the Collector knew my name. It started with the first gift. I had been working late one night, poring over notes in my apartment. My research was spread across the floor in chaotic piles, photographs of the victims, police reports, and the obsessive timeline I had drawn to map out the murders. The apartment was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old building settling. I was focused, but an eerie sense of dread had begun to creep into my bones. It was the kind of feeling you get when you know you're being watched, but you can't see anyone. The knock at my door was so faint, I almost didn't hear it. My heart jumped into my throat as I stood, trying to shake off the unease. I walked to the door, telling myself it was just a neighbour or a delivery I'd forgotten about. But when I opened it, there was no one there. Just a small, elegantly wrapped box on the floor. I stared at it for a moment, a chill running down my spine. The box was tied with a red ribbon, neat and pristine, as if it had been placed with care. Hesitant, I bent down and picked it up, the weight of it light in my hands. A part of me wanted to toss it in the trash right then and there, but I couldn't. My curiosity got the better of me. Inside was a single white rose. It seemed harmless enough, but there was something wrong about it, something too deliberate. I lifted the flower out of the box and noticed a small card tucked beneath it. My name was written on the card in looping, delicate handwriting, Evelyn. I dropped the box, my heart pounding in my chest. No one outside of my editor knew I was investigating the Collector. I had kept my work quiet, avoiding any public mention of the case until I had something solid to report. So how did they know? How did he know? I spent the rest of the night pacing my apartment, every creak and groan of the old building making me jump. The rose sat on my desk, a silent reminder that the Collector knew exactly who I was, and that he could get to me anytime he wanted. The second gift arrived 3 days later. By then, I had convinced myself the first delivery had been a fluke, maybe some deranged admirer or a prank by one of my more morbid readers, but the second box shattered any illusions I'd clung to. This one was larger, heavier, and when I opened it, I was greeted with something that turned my stomach. It was a small heart, Not a human one, not yet. It looked like a pig's heart, though I didn't care to investigate too closely. I nearly dropped it in horror, backing away from the box as if it might come alive. The smell of blood hit me next, iron-rich and metallic, and I gagged, covering my mouth as I stared at the grotesque gift. Another card was tucked beneath it, the same looping handwriting scrawled across it. For the heart of the story. Keep looking, Evelyn. I called the police after that. What else could I do? They took the box, the heart, and the note, promising they'd look into it. But I could tell from their faces that they weren't taking me seriously. To them, I was just another journalist digging too deep into a case that had already terrified the city for years. They had no answers, no leads. I was on my own. I couldn't sleep after that. I could barely eat. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the heart. Saw it beating, pulsing in my mind. A constant reminder that I was being watched, stalked like prey. I tried to keep my investigation going, but the deeper I dug, the more dangerous it became. The collector had been careful, so careful. He, or she, had evaded capture for decades, the police never getting more than a faint whiff of evidence. The bodies had been perfectly preserved, the hearts removed with surgical precision, and each one of the victims had suffered from severe emotional trauma. Loss, grief, anger, things that would mark them as damaged in the eyes of a killer like the collector. I had begun to suspect that the killer wasn't just picking random people off the street. No, the victims were being selected, like ingredients for a twisted recipe. I combed through old case files, tracking down anyone who had known the victims. That's when I found the connection to myself. It was subtle at first, buried in the minutiae of one of the victims' lives. Her name was Angela Hale, a woman who had been found dead nearly 20 years ago, her heart missing, her body posed like a tragic figure in a Renaissance painting. As I read through her background, one detail caught my attention. She had lived in my old neighborhood, just a few blocks from where I grew up. At first, it seemed like a coincidence, but the more I looked, the more connections I found. Angela had known my mother. They had been acquaintances, if not friends. My mother had died when I was young, a loss that had shaped much of who I was. But I never knew Angela, never knew she was connected to my family in any way. It felt too deliberate, too personal. The third gift was the worst. It arrived one evening, long after I had given up trying to pretend that I wasn't terrified. I hadn't left my apartment in days, and the isolation was starting to get to me. Every noise outside my door felt like a threat. Every shadow that passed by my window felt like it was watching me. I was unraveling, and I knew it. The box was sitting just outside my door again, but this time I didn't want to open it. I knew what would be inside. My hands shook as I picked it up and carried it to the kitchen, setting it on the counter like it was a bomb. I stood there for a long time, staring at it, my heart pounding in my chest. When I finally opened it, the contents confirmed my worst fears. It was a human heart. This one was fresh, the blood still wet and sticky, the smell overpowering. My vision blurred, and I had to grab onto the counter to steady myself. My mind screamed at me to call the police again, to run, to do anything but stand there and stare at the grisly trophy. But I was frozen. There was another note, of course. This time, the message was different. You've been marked, Evelyn. Your heart is the last piece. The walls closed in after that. Every sound, every flicker of light felt like it was part of some grand, horrible plan. I knew the collector was watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. I considered going to the police again. But what could they do? They hadn't caught him in over 30 years. They wouldn't start now. I had only one option left. Confront the collector myself. I dug through everything I had. Every lead, every name, every tiny piece of the puzzle. And slowly, I began to see the pattern. The collector had been following me for a long time, waiting in the shadows, weaving himself into the fabric of my life without me even realizing it. He had always been close, too close. And then I found it, the address. A condemned building in the industrial part of the city where no one would go unless they had a death wish. It was where the victims had been taken. I was sure of it. Where the collector had made his twisted art. The building was a monument to decay. Rusted metal, broken windows, and the stench of mildew filled the air as I stepped inside, flashlight trembling in my hand. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I moved through the darkened corridors, the faint echo of my footsteps the only sound. I knew I was walking into a trap, but I had no other choice. If I didn't confront him, I would always be looking over my shoulder, waiting for the knife to slip between my ribs. Better to face him now, head on. At the end of the hall I saw it, a door, slightly ajar, with faint light spilling out from the crack beneath it. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat echoing in my ears. This was it. Behind that door, I would find the truth, the collector, and possibly my end. My hand shook as I reached for the door, pushing it open. The room beyond was large and dimly lit by flickering overhead bulbs. And then I saw it. Them. The walls were covered with frames. Human hearts, perfectly preserved, mounted like grotesque pieces of art. Each one was carefully labelled with a small brass plaque, engraved with the name of the victim. My stomach twisted as I read the names. Angela Hale, Mark Roberts, Alison Payne, all the people I had investigated, their hearts now trophies in this deranged gallery. The scent of formaldehyde mixed with the metallic tang of blood filled the room, making me gag. But worse than the smell was the realization that this wasn't just a display. It was a monument. The collector had turned his victims into art, a twisted representation of his power and control. And then, from the far corner of the room, I heard a voice, low, calm, and utterly devoid of emotion. I was wondering when you'd come. I turned sharply, my flashlight sweeping across the room until it landed on a figure standing in the shadows. He stepped forward slowly, into the weak light, and I finally saw him, the collector. He wasn't some monster in the dark. He looked normal, almost unremarkable, a man in his 40s, well-groomed, wearing a simple black coat. His expression was calm, almost serene, as if this room filled with hearts was just another ordinary gallery. "You've been following me," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and anger. "Why? What do you want?" The collector smiled, a thin, ghostly smile that never reached his eyes. "I've been watching you for a long time, Evelyn. You've been searching for me, getting closer with every step. And now, here you are, right where you're supposed to be." I took a step back, my heart racing as the walls of the room seemed to close in on me. "What do you mean? Why me?" He tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question, then gestured to the hearts on the wall. Each of them had something special, something broken inside. Their pain made them valuable. I only collect those who have truly suffered, those whose hearts have been shaped by trauma. And you, Evelyn, you're perfect. I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're insane." "Perhaps," he said softly, taking a step closer. "But it's not about me, is it? It's about you. Your mother's death, your obsession with the story, your need to understand why people suffer. It's all led you here." I shook my head, backing away toward the door. "I'm nothing like your other victims." The collector's smile widened. "That's what they all say at first. But you've already been marked, Evelyn. Your heart is the final piece in my masterpiece." I reached for the doorknob, ready to bolt, but it wouldn't budge. It was locked, and the faint sound of metal scraping told me that the collector had planned this from the beginning. He had lured me here, set the trap, and now there was no escape. "I won't let you do this," I said, my voice shaking but defiant. "I won't let you turn me into one of your trophies." The collector took another step forward, his calm demeanor never faltering. "It's not up to you. It never was." I wasn't going to let him take me without a fight. I grabbed a heavy metal tool from a nearby table and swung it at him, but he was faster than I expected. He dodged, his expression still maddeningly serene, and before I could react, he lunged at me, knocking the tool from my hand. We struggled, his hands gripping my wrists like iron. I kicked out, managing to push him away long enough to get to my feet, but the room was spinning. I could feel the weight of the past few weeks, the fear, the sleepless nights, dragging me down, making me slow. The collector circled me like a predator, his eyes dark and calculating. "You think you're the first to fight back?" They all did, in the end, but it doesn't change anything. It only makes their hearts more beautiful when they finally give in. I wasn't going to let him win. I couldn't. I darted toward a side door at the far end of the room, throwing it open and stumbling into a narrow hallway. The air was thick with dust, the sound of my footsteps echoing as I ran. Behind me, I heard the collector's measured steps, never hurried, never frantic. He didn't need to rush. He knew I had nowhere to go. I turned a corner and found myself in another room, similar to the first, but this one was empty. Just bare concrete walls and a single, small mirror hanging on one side. I paused, gasping for breath, and stared at my reflection. I looked haggard, broken. My face was pale, my hair disheveled, and my eyes wide with terror. I had never seen myself look so vulnerable, so defeated. And then I saw him, reflected in the mirror standing right behind me. I spun around, but the collector was gone. I was alone, or so I thought. The mirror was a trick. I could hear him now, his footsteps slow and deliberate, getting closer. I had to keep moving, had to keep thinking. But my mind was racing, my body betraying me with exhaustion and panic. I ran again, deeper into the labyrinth of rooms, each one more claustrophobic than the last. The smell of blood and decay hung in the air, and with every step, I felt like I was sinking deeper into the collector's nightmare. This was his domain. I was the intruder. And then I found it. The final room. In the center of the room stood a pedestal, and on that pedestal was a glass case. Inside it was the most horrifying thing I'd ever seen, a grotesque sculpture, meticulously crafted from human hearts, twisted and intertwined like some nightmarish form of art. At the base of the sculpture, a plaque read, "The final piece." The realization hit me like a freight train. This was it. This was where I would die. But then I heard the voice. His voice, smooth and almost soothing. "You see, Evelyn, it's all been leading to this. You were always meant to be part of my masterpiece." I turned slowly, my eyes locking onto the collector as he emerged from the shadows. He was holding a scalpel now, the blade gleaming in the low light. "Your heart," he whispered, "will complete it." I don't know what gave me the strength, but in that moment, something inside me snapped. I wasn't going to be his victim. I wasn't going to end up as another lifeless piece of his twisted collection. With every ounce of willpower I had left, I lunged at him, grabbing a piece of broken glass from the floor and slashing wildly. The collector's eyes widened in surprise as the glass cut across his arm, but it didn't stop him. He grabbed me by the throat, pushing me back against the wall, his grip tightening. For a moment I thought it was over. I could feel the life draining from me, the room spinning, my vision blurring. But then, with one final burst of strength, I thrust the broken glass into his side. The collector let out a low grunt of pain, his grip loosening just enough for me to break free. I stumbled backward, gasping for air, and watched as the collector fell to his knees, his face still calm, still serene, even as blood soaked through his shirt. "It doesn't matter," he whispered, his voice weak but steady. "You'll never be free of me. You'll always carry this with you." I looked down at him, my heart pounding in my chest. "No," I said, my voice hoarse. "You're wrong." And with that, I turned and ran, leaving him behind in his twisted gallery of death. I don't know how I made it out of that building. The details are a blur. Flashing lights, sirens, police officers shouting at me to stop. But I didn't stop. I couldn't. The collector was dead. I had survived. But as I sit here writing this, I can't shake the feeling that he was right. I'll never be free of him. Not really. Because every time I look in the mirror, I see him. And I know he's still watching.
The Puppet Master. I had seen my fair share of death, more than enough to make most people numb to it. But this was something else entirely. I stood there, flashlight in hand, staring down at the latest scene. A body, no older than 25, was posed like a grotesque marionette in the center of an abandoned theater. His limbs were bent and twisted, wires embedded deep into his flesh, holding him up in the air as though he were performing some macabre ballet. His face, twisted in an expression of sheer terror, was frozen in the harsh light that filtered through the broken windows above. This was the work of the Puppet Master. The name alone sent a chill down my spine, not because of its theatrical flair, but because this was the sixth body we had found. Each one posed in a similar fashion, each one a part of this psychopath's twisted performance. I was lead detective on the case, and I had been chasing this ghost for nearly a year now. But the closer I got, the further the truth seemed to slip away from me. The city had never seen anything like this. The victims had no connection to one another, at least none that we could find. There were no fingerprints, no DNA left behind, just the bodies, posed like puppets, each one arranged with wires and strings. And then there were the notes. Always a note. Tonight's read, "Every puppet needs its master." I sighed, running a hand through my hair, feeling the weight of exhaustion settling in my bones. I had spent the last several nights poring over every detail of the case, revisiting crime scenes, combing through files, anything to find a break. But the Puppet Master was always 2 steps ahead, always watching. "Detective Marlowe," came a voice from behind me. I turned to see Officer Hughes, a fresh-faced kid who had been working with me on the case since the beginning. He looked pale, shaken. I couldn't blame him. Even seasoned detectives were rattled by this case. "What is it?" I asked, my voice gruff from lack of sleep. Hughes held out an envelope. "Found this on the stage." I frowned and took the envelope from him, tearing it open with a quick motion. Inside was a photograph, a grainy black and white shot of me standing outside my apartment. It had been taken recently. The timestamp in the corner told me it had been less than a week ago. "Son of a bitch," I muttered under my breath. Hughes looked at me, wide-eyed. "He's watching you, isn't he?" I didn't answer. I didn't have to. The Puppet Master wasn't just playing games with his victims. He was playing games with me. This photograph wasn't just a taunt. It was a message. He knew where I lived, knew where I slept. And now, more than ever, I knew that this wasn't just about the victims. It was about me. The city looked different at night, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of streetlights. The dark alleyways and abandoned buildings cast long, jagged shadows that seemed to move and writhe with the slightest breeze. It was as if the entire city had turned into one giant stage, with the Puppet Master pulling the strings from behind the scenes. I drove through the nearly deserted streets, my mind racing. How had he gotten so close? I had taken precautions, been careful. My apartment was secure, my phone encrypted, but none of that mattered now. He was watching me, and the question that gnawed at me was how. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, interrupting my thoughts. I picked it up, half expecting it to be another anonymous message from the Puppet Master. But it wasn't. It was a voicemail from my ex-wife, Sarah. I hesitated, then hit play. "Hey Alex, it's me. I know it's late, but I wanted to check in. I've been hearing about these killings, and I'm worried about you. I know you don't want to talk, but please just call me back when you can. I turned it off. I couldn't do this right now. Sarah had always been the cautious one, always trying to pull me back from the edge. But this case was different. I wasn't just chasing a killer. I was part of it now. Back at my apartment, I found another envelope waiting for me. This one slipped under my door. My pulse quickened as I tore it open, revealing another photograph. This one was of Sarah, taken from outside her house. The same black and white grainy quality, the same chilling timestamp, taken earlier today. I clenched my fists, my blood running cold. He was threatening her now. He knew she was still part of my life, even after all these years, after the divorce. I hadn't seen her in months, barely talked to her, but that didn't matter. He knew. He always knew. There was a note too, written in that same elegant script. I control the strings, detective. She's next. I slammed my fist into the wall, rage bubbling up inside me. The puppet master was pushing me, pulling me deeper into his game, and I had no idea how to stop him. No idea how to protect the people I cared about. I needed a break. I needed to figure out who this man was before it was too late. The next morning I called Sarah. She picked up on the third ring, her voice soft and tired. "Alex?" "Sarah, listen to me. You need to get out of the house." "What? Why?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "Just trust me. Pack a bag and go stay with your sister or check into a hotel. I don't care. Just don't stay at your place." There was a long pause, and I could hear the tension in her voice when she finally answered. "Is this about the case? About the puppet master?" I didn't want to tell her, didn't want to drag her into the nightmare, but she deserved the truth. "Yes," I said quietly. "He knows about you. He's watching you, Sarah." Her breath hitched. "Oh my God. I'm going to protect you, I swear. But you need to leave now." "Okay," she whispered. "Okay, I'll go." I hung up, my mind spinning. Sarah was safe for now, but how long would that last? How long before the puppet master found her, or worse, before he used her as bait to get to me? As the days passed, I dove deeper into the case, poring over every detail, every photograph, every scrap of evidence we had on the puppet master. I worked around the clock, barely eating, barely sleeping. But it was as if the more I looked, the less I understood. He was always one step ahead, always watching. And then, one night, I found it. Buried deep in the files was a name that had come up in the earliest investigation, but had been dismissed as irrelevant. A man named Ethan Mallory. He had been a stagehand at several local theatres back in the 1990s, around the time the first puppet master killings had started. His file mentioned that he had once been arrested for assaulting an actress during a production, but the charges had been dropped. My gut told me this was it. Mallory had the background, the skills, the knowledge of how to manipulate people, how to pose them, and he had disappeared from the radar shortly after the first murder. If anyone could be the puppet master, it was him. I pulled up everything I could on Mallory, tracing his movements through the years. He had lived in the city for decades, always working in the shadows of the theatre scene, always staying just out of sight. But then I found something that made my blood run cold. Mallory had once worked at a small, abandoned theatre on the edge of town. A theatre that had closed down years ago. A theatre that was only a few blocks from my apartment. I didn't wait. I grabbed my gun, my badge, and raced to the old theatre. The building was a crumbling relic, its facade cracked and peeling, the windows boarded up. But I knew he was inside. I could feel it. The front door creaked as I pushed it open, the darkness inside swallowing me whole. I moved slowly, my flashlight casting long, thin beams of light across the dusty floor. The silence was deafening, the kind that pressed in on you, making every step feel like a betrayal. As I moved deeper into the theatre, I began to notice something. Strings, thin, almost invisible wires, hanging from the ceiling, stretching across the room like the web of a giant spider. They crisscrossed the stage, the aisles, the seats, everything. and in the center of the stage was a single chair, empty, waiting. And then I heard it, his voice. "You found me, detective." I spun around, my gun drawn, but there was no one there, just the echo of his words bouncing off the walls. "You've been such a good puppet, following the clues, doing exactly as I wanted. And now, here we are, the final act." My heart raced as I realized the truth. He had been controlling me from the beginning, pulling the strings, guiding me to this moment. And now, I was exactly where he wanted me to be. The lights above flickered, and for the first time, I saw him. The puppet master, standing in the shadows, his face hidden behind a mask of white porcelain, his hands moving gracefully as if conducting a symphony of death. "You see, detective," he said, his voice calm and composed, "you've always been part of my masterpiece. I've been watching you, molding you, preparing you for this moment. You are the final puppet." I tried to move, to run, but I couldn't. The strings, the invisible wires were wrapped around me, binding me to the stage. I struggled, but it was no use. He had me. The puppet master stepped forward, his eyes gleaming behind the mask. "Now," he whispered, "dance." And with that, the wires tightened, pulling me into the air, twisting my limbs into grotesque, unnatural poses. Pain shot through my body as I felt the strings dig into my skin, pulling tighter and tighter. I was his puppet now. I don't know how long I was up there, suspended in the air, my body contorted like the others. Time seemed to lose all meaning. All I knew was the pain, the suffocating tightness of the strings, and the sound of his voice whispering in my ear. The puppet master had won. He had always been in control. And now I was just another piece in his twisted performance.
"I have loved you since the moment I first laid eyes on you. Call it love at first sight if you want, but for me, it was something far deeper, something that rooted itself in my soul in a way that I could never fully explain to anyone else. You know this, don't you? From the very first instant, you became the most important person in my life, the center of my universe. Everything changed for me in that moment. You brought meaning to a world that had once been empty and dark, and I knew I was destined to love you forever. I remember the day I first saw you like it was yesterday. Your hair shimmered under the sunlight and your smile lit up my world. It was the best day of my life. I sat from a distance, sipping my coffee, watching how you interacted with those around you. Everything about you seemed perfect. Every gesture, every laugh. I knew that moment was the beginning of something special. At first, I kept my distance, just watching, admiring. But as the days passed, I felt my need to be close to you grow stronger and stronger. I decided to approach, to observe you more closely, but without interfering with your routine. That's how I discovered your name, Lily, and began to follow your steps with more precision. I was always there, in the background, in every place, during your moments of joy, of sadness, even when no one else was watching. Do you remember that man who spoke ill of you, who insulted you in front of everyone? I remember the way your eyes filled with tears, how you left crying, devastated by this cruel world. At that moment, I promised myself that no one would ever hurt you again. I watched from afar as he humiliated you, saw the way he made you feel small, and I felt a rage boil inside me. How dare he speak to you like that? How dare he tarnish your light? I knew I had to act. I followed him that night, waited until he was alone, walking down the dark, desert streets. I approached him silently, my heart pounding with fury. He turned around, sensing my presence, and I saw fear flash in his eyes. I smiled at him, calm, collected smile that I knew would unsettle him. And then I took care of it. I made sure he would never speak to you like that again, never hurt you again. For you, my love, I would do anything. When you found out he had disappeared, I saw the confusion on your face, the worry in your eyes. But don't worry, my love. I was there to console you, to help you through that difficult time. I was there to protect you, to love you. I wanted you to see me, to know that I was the one who would always keep you safe, who would always be there for you. But tell me, why are you not responding to me now? Of course, I forgot for a moment that I ended your life just a short time ago. Don't worry, my love. Everything was done with care, as gently as possible. You didn't feel any pain, not really. It was quick, quiet, and now we are together forever. Look, we've arrived at the place I prepared for you. Come, meet my other loves. But remember, even here, among them, you are special. I love you. Never forget that. This room is not a mausoleum. No, it's a paradise where my eternal love rests, where I can be with each of them forever. On the walls, there are shelves lined with the women who were as special to me as you are now. Their bodies are wrapped in white cloth, carefully preserved. Their faces serene as if in peace, frozen in time. My hands are gentle as I touch your face, as if handling something fragile and precious. I begin the embalming process with all the care in the world, wrapping your body with the same delicacy I use with the others. The room's filled with the smell of the products I use to preserve my loves, the sweet aroma of eternity that fills in the air, creating our story of eternal love. The moment we met, I remember so clearly how I found you. It all began that first time I saw you in the coffee shop, smiling at a colleague. I felt an instant connection, something I had never felt before. From that moment on, you became the center of my thoughts. I followed you carefully, observed every detail of your life, studied your habits, learned everything about you. Each step you took was a new discovery, each smile a confirmation of the love growing inside me. Because I truly love you. And then came the day when I decided we needed to be together forever. I waited patiently until we were alone at the bus stop late at night. The city was deserted, the streets plunged into darkness. I approached silently like a ghost. The fear in your eyes when I grabbed you was the moment when our souls truly connected, a moment of a pure emotion. You tried to fight, you screamed, but I was there to take care of everything. I brought you to my car where I had already prepared everything. Your screams were muffled by the tape I used to gag your mouth. Your eyes crying in panic were a reflection of the intensity of our encounter. The journey to the sacred place was long, every second a testament to the love I felt for you. And then, when we finally reached our destination, I brought you here, where we would be together forever. Now, as I wrap your body in strips of cloth, sealing it for eternity, I whisper words of love in your ear. For me, this is the purest proof of my eternal love. Your lifeless body is carefully placed on one of the shelves next to the other women I loved before you. Each of them, preserved forever, is part of my personal paradise where I can love and be loved eternally. I give one last look at the room, satisfied with what I have created. This is my work, my masterpiece, where love never dies, where each of my muses rests in peace, forever holding on to the love we shared. And so, the day after, I went to have my coffee at my favorite coffee shop, and that's when I found you, my love. My God, how I love you so much. Can't wait to bring you to my paradise.